Now to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion 22437 in the name of Michael Russell on internal market. Could I invite members who wish to contribute to the debate to press their request to speak buttons? And I call on Jenny Gilruth to speak to and to move the motion. Jenny Gilruth.
Presiding Officer, in 1997, the people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly by 74% to 26% to establish this Scottish Parliament. Many will have done so to stop a Conservative Party with no mandate in Scotland from imposing policies with little or no support. Throughout the 18-year period of Conservative rule in the 1980s and the 1990s, the Tories tried to recast Scotland in their own right-wing image. That undoubtedly was a major driver for many people in the campaign for devolution. Parties with different views of Scotland's ultimate constitutional destination came together and focused on where we agreed rather than on where we disagreed. I hope in this debate today we will see a similar spirit, because the Tories haven't lost their hunger to recast Scotland in that right-wing image. The previous Tory tactic was to try to stop the Scottish Parliament from being re-established. Having failed, today the Tory tactic is to try to bypass and constrain this Parliament and Scotland's democratic choices. That is what the UK Government's internal market proposals will do. They take power from this Parliament and they hand it to Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings in Westminster. The Tories have hijacked and distorted reasonable principles such as mutual recognition and non-discrimination to disguise this power grab. And to add insult to injury, not only do their proposals flagrantly undermine devolution, but they use Brexit, which the people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly against, as a justification for doing so. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government will oppose these proposals at every opportunity, and we will work across this chamber with the people and businesses of Scotland to build consensus in doing so. And I give way to the member.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you very much. Jenny Gilruth mentions that the UK Government is undermining devolution and the powers of this Government, but under the SNP's EU Continuity Bill, introduced by the Cabinet Secretary, this Parliament will become a passive rule-taker, be required to adopt regulations without any real scrutiny, and these new regulations will force business in Scotland to comply with the requirements of two conflicting regulatory systems. Does she not recognise the fundamental contradictions in her arguments?
Jenny Gilruth.
I have to say that is completely untrue. In terms of handing back powers to Brussels because of EU law, what the Tories are planning would be unlawful. And in terms of EU laws and standards, every single country would need to agree to it under EU legislation. In this context, we're not being asked for permission, we're not being asked for our views to be looked at. It's an overriding of this Parliament, and it's a kind of unitary approach to doing so. So I don't accept the point that the member makes at all. To move on, Presiding Officer. The UK Government attempts to justify these proposals on the grounds that, having taken Scotland out of the EU and the rules that govern its single market, new arrangements are needed to ensure trade continues as now across the UK. Yet UK ministers have so far been unable to provide an example, not a single one, of devolution threatening trade across the UK. The reality, as the Scottish Government's initial analysis of the White Paper shows, is that devolution is a driver, not an inhibitor of prosperity. And the White Paper's repeated dogmatic insistence on the danger of barriers to trade sits oddly with the UK Government's decision to remove Scotland and the UK from the EU, a prosperous and highly integrated trade and regulatory partnership of 450 million consumers. This is, of course, the real threat to trade and prosperity in Scotland and across the UK. Presiding Officer, I want to set out to the Chamber today very clearly why these proposals are such a threat to devolution, to jobs, to businesses and to consumers and citizens across Scotland. On devolution, there is an explicit power grab, a blatant acknowledgement that the UK Government is going to reserve the devolved policy area of state aid. But, as reported in the Financial Times, this is clearly a source of tension within the UK Government. Indeed, an individual close to the discussions was quoted as saying the current plan is an odd combination of reserving state aid from control from London and then agreeing to a free-for-all. They just want to be able to bung money at things and do not want UK internal market legislation cutting across that. It's very confused. Elsewhere, the UK Government wants to introduce a system where standards set by Westminster must be accepted in Scotland in devolved areas, utterly regardless of the wishes and the people of Scotland or the votes passed in this Parliament. The implications of this are clear and profoundly worrying. Scotland's world-class food and drink industry employs more than 115,000 jobs across the country and is worth £15 billion a year to the Scottish economy. Its success is built on the quality and provenance guarantees that come with the Scottish brand. Indeed, the UK Chancellor described Scotland as one of the UK Government's powerhouse brands on a visit to the Cabinet Secretary's constituency just the other week. But Rishi Sunak didn't mention that brand Scotland will be under direct threat from a US trade deal that lowers standards on food safety and animal welfare. He didn't mention this threat exists because the UK Government refused to accept an amendment to its agriculture bill which would have protected farming from substandard food imports. He didn't mention that all 6 Tory MPs from Scotland voted shamefully against this amendment. Under the UK's internal market proposals, if Westminster accepts those lower standards, then Scotland will be forced to accept them as well. And I look forward to Douglas Ross explaining that one to the farmers of Moray when he's not too busy running the line. Indeed. There will be the ever-present threat of court action being taken by companies with deep pockets. Paragraph 9 of the White Paper says the proposed legislation will guarantee the continued right of all UK companies to trade unhindered in every part of the UK. So, are private health companies operating in England or private water companies operating in England to have a guaranteed right to trade in Scotland? Yeah. Presiding Officer, members should remember that when the Tories say that Brexit will be good for business. These are exactly the type of businesses they mean, a race to the bottom with nothing off the table, to quote Donald Trump. Presiding Officer, these are not just the Scottish Government's concerns. Despite the ludicrously short consultation period, as alluded to in the Greens amendment today, 4 weeks in the middle of recess, months before the end of the transition period and in the midst of a global pandemic, organisations from key sectors across Scotland, business, industry, farming, teaching and the environment, have made clear that these proposals are unacceptable. The National Farmers Union says that the proposals pose a significant threat to the development of common frameworks and to devolution. The NFU stresses the need for agricultural support policies to diverge where necessary to reflect the different needs and objectives of the parts of the UK. No, thank you. The Scottish Council for Development and Industry warns that the imposition of a single approach across the UK in devolved policy areas could be to the detriment of Scottish business and consumers. Scottish Environment Link is clear that the UK Government plans could force Scotland to follow the lowest common denominator, especially where countries negotiating bilateral trade deals with the UK demand lower standards, seriously undermining efforts to combat climate change and biodiversity decline. And the General Teaching Council for Scotland, and I refer members to my register of interests, say they would not support the White Paper proposals for the Scottish teaching profession and believes that to do so would undermine the 4 UK nations' devolved education functions. Presiding Officer, the White Paper says that there will be exclusions for these measures, but paragraphs 50 and 144 make it clear that those exclusions could change. And paragraph 154 makes it clear who would decide those changes. It will be Westminster and not this Parliament. The White Paper says the Government has made clear that the evolution and overall shape of the UK's internal market will be overseen by the UK Parliament and that key decisions will be put to the UK Parliament for approval. So everything is up for grabs. Presiding Officer, this proposed new law is also wholly unnecessary to protect trade. The Scottish Government has participated in good faith in the Common Frameworks project, and once implemented, these voluntary arrangements are more than adequate to address any of the regulatory consequences of leaving the European single market. Work is progressing well on the Common Frameworks despite the difficulties caused by the UK Government's changing Brexit policy. And the Scottish Government has now agreed with the other devolved governments a revised delivery plan for Common Frameworks. We remain fully committed to work to deliver those frameworks on the basis of mutual agreement between the devolved governments across the United Kingdom. But for the frameworks to operate as intended, we need far greater clarity and detail from the UK Government. We still don't know what the UK's future relationship with the UK will look like in less than 5 months of the transition period left. I now want to address perhaps the fundamental flaw in these proposals for the UK Government. The entirely inaccurate assertion that this is simply a matter of replicating the system of harmonised standards that the UK enjoyed as an EU member state. This misconception comes partly from the assumption that there is a clearly defined and commonly understood system of laws and institutions that defines the UK internal market in a way that is comparable with the European single market. The White Paper ignores the profound differences in the way power is exercised and decisions are made in the EU, as opposed to the regime envisaged in the UK Government's internal market proposals. For example, the development of the European single market has been based on the principles of equality, cooperation, co-decision, subsidiarity and consent, and setting a baseline of minimum agreed standards that all Member States' own rules must be compatible with. The UK Government's proposals are based on unilateral decision-making and imposition, with no minimum standards or guarantees, providing a vice-like grip for a government with no electoral mandate in Scotland. But the European single market rules recognise and allow for policy objectives alongside pure market economic considerations, for example, the health benefits of minimum unit pricing. The European single market principles ensure the decisions are taken as close to affected citizens as possible, that Member States abide by the rules agreed to by the EU, and that rights can be enforced by individuals and companies against their own governments if necessary. The institutions of the EU also ensure that regional variations are taken into account. The UK Government is, in fact, proposing the opposite of the European single market approach. The White Paper includes no mechanism for negotiation or agreement between the four governments of the UK. Instead, the mutual recognition mechanism would allow the UK Government to decide its standards for England, which would have to be accepted across the other nations of the UK. In practice, this would reserve the right under the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty to undo any decisions taken by the devolved governments, which might be considered a constraint on the decision-making powers of the UK Parliament. And in reality, this means that the UK Government could impose decisions on the devolved governments with no right of appeal and no means of redress. The Conservatives are kidding themselves if they can't see how this undermines the very foundations of devolution. Indeed, as a distinguished legal commentator, Professor Michael Dugan, has noted, the parliamentary sovereignty of Westminster means that inherently the legislative aspect of the internal market will never be independent and impartial in a way that would be recognised in the EU. And the White Paper makes it clear that the UK Government wants to impose uniform standards in policy areas such as building regulations that were never part of the European single market rules. Presiding Officer, the Tories were anti-devolutionists in 1997, and much like then, the Tories have got this badly wrong. But it is not too late for them to change their tact. These proposals will be bad for business. It is not devolution, but the reckless decision of the UK Government to leave not just the EU, but the transition period in less than 5 months' time, in the middle of an economic crisis that is causing business uncertainty. These proposals will be bad for consumers. They will open the door to lower food standards, and they will provide an end to the precautionary principle that has served Scotland so well. And these proposals will be disastrous for devolution. This Parliament's wishes and the democratic choices of the people of Scotland will be undermined and overridden. The Scottish Government will not stand for it, and neither should the Scottish Parliament. I move the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I call Dean Lockhart to open for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister, in her opening remarks, raised a number of constitutional questions surrounding the UK Government's proposals for the internal market. Before I deal with those questions, I think it's vital that we recognise the wider economic context in which we debate those proposals. We are in the middle of the most serious economic crisis in memory, and people in Scotland quite rightly want this Parliament to focus on the issues that matter most to them. Young people entering the workforce, worried about whether they can find a job, small business owners facing closure, and thousands of workers who are worried that their job might disappear at any moment. And that's what this debate should be about: safeguarding the jobs, livelihoods and small businesses throughout Scotland who depend on trade with the rest of the UK for their survival. Because it's trade with the UK internal market that supports more than 60% of all trade in Scotland. And according to the Fraser Vounder Institute, trade with the UK internal market supports some 550,000 jobs across Scotland. This economic context was emphasised by the CBI earlier this week when it said that the UK internal market is key to increasing prosperity, raising living standards and opportunities for people across the UK. And the Scottish Retail Consortium made it clear, I will in a second, made it clear that Scottish consumers benefit enormously from unfettered access to the internal market, which helps to reduce shop prices and provides more choice. I'll give way to Alex Rowley.
Thank
Mr Lockhart for giving way. I understand the logic of his argument in the current crisis that we're in. Does the logic of that not therefore mean that we should have accepted Europe's offer, allowed an extension of the process to negotiate Brexit and actually get ourselves through this current crisis? Is that not the logic of the argument you're making?
Dean Lockhart.
No, that's not the argument I was making. Unlike Mr Rowley, I'm very confident that a comprehensive free trade agreement will be in place at the end of the transition period. Presiding Officer, in her opening remarks, the Minister claimed that the UK Government's proposals will undermine devolution and create significant uncertainty for business in Scotland. But we won't be taking any lectures from the Minister in these areas because, as I said, it is the SNP's EU Continuity Bill which will force this Parliament to become a passive rule-taker, require it to adopt new EU regulations without scrutiny, and by doing so force business in Scotland to comply with the requirements of two conflicting jurisdictions. And in doing so, the EU Continuity Bill would effectively take, I will in a second, the Minister should listen to this, because the EU Continuity Bill would effectively take a wrecking ball to the UK internal market. Presiding Officer, the Minister also claims that the UK Government is determined to undermine devolution and the powers of Parliament. Well, the reality of the past decades shows us precisely the opposite. Over the past decade, the UK Conservative Government has transferred unprecedented powers to this Parliament, including areas in taxation, 11 different welfare powers, although they're not used by the SNP, and areas covering consumer protection. Minister, that's what real devolution looks like. Presiding Officer, let me now turn to the constitutional questions raised in the Minister's opening remarks. The internal market proposals cannot be viewed in isolation. They have to be seen in the context of the significant new powers coming to this Parliament. Because at the end of the transition period, the Scottish Parliament will enjoy a power surge, making this Parliament more powerful than ever. This power surge will be delivered by the transfer of powers through three different avenues. First of all, the direct transfer of over 100 additional powers from the EU coming straight to this Parliament for the first time. Powers in a number of different areas, including air quality, animal welfare, land use and energy efficiency. Powers which currently sit with the EU, but powers which the SNP want to surrender straight back to the EU. Cabinet Secretary will in a second, but you have to listen to this. These are powers you want to surrender straight back to the EU in what would be the biggest power surrender this Parliament has ever seen. I will give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Excellent, good.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
I just wonder if the member has ever been present in a debate in this chamber on, say, animal welfare or food standards, which have been setting powers and regulations. Did these not exist? Was that a fantasy? Or, as is more likely, is the repetition of Michael Gove's fantasy simply what he has to do in his job?
Dean Lockhart.
I'm amazed the Cabinet Secretary has to ask that question. He views powers as one-dimensional. Some of those additional powers come in areas which the Scottish Parliament has competence in already, but they are additional powers nonetheless, Cabinet Secretary. You should know that. Presiding Officer, if the SNP had it their way, they would hand back powers over Scotland's fishing sector, reversing the chance for us to become an independent coastal state. And they would hand back powers over Scottish agriculture. And that's the ultimate hypocrisy of the SNP's approach to these proposals. At a time when the UK Government wants to make this Parliament the most powerful it's ever been, the SNP instead wants to surrender these powers back to Brussels. The second avenue of additional powers coming to this Parliament will come under the common frameworks to be agreed between the UK Government and devolved administrations. All administrations, quite rightly, agree that powers under these common frameworks will form a cornerstone of the UK internal market and deliver a balance between ensuring the proper functioning of the internal market, while at the same time recognising competent policy divergence at devolved levels. The common frameworks will also deliver significant new powers to this Parliament in vital areas such as fishing, agriculture and public procurement. Paragraph 16 of the Scottish Government response to the White Paper anticipates that 6 common frameworks applicable to Scotland will be fully implemented by the end of this year, with provisional frameworks being established in 25 remaining policy areas. We do hope this is the case, and we will work with the Scottish Government to achieve those outcomes. Earlier today, I spoke to the NFUS, and the Minister is right to say that their absolute priority is for the common frameworks on agriculture to be agreed to secure common standards and regulatory divergence in that sector. But this will only be possible if there is a new constructive approach taken by the Scottish Government. The Cabinet Secretary's decision to walk away from the common framework discussions 18 months ago represented a massive lost opportunity to progress these frameworks. And I encourage the Cabinet Secretary to accept the offer
Mr Lockhart, I think Mr Russell wants to make a point of order rather than an intervention. Point of
Mr.
order.
Lockhart is not yet the presiding officer. Could I ask for you to insist upon, if you possibly can, accuracy and not to allow members to say things which are not true? The Scottish Government has not departed from the Common Frameworks process, did not depart from it and won't depart from it, and it would be wrong to mislead the Chamber.
I will rule on points of accuracy. However, I think these are debating points. Dean Lockhart.
Thank you. I would refer the Cabinet Secretary to the evidence he gave last week to the Finance Committee, where he said that he and officials walked away from discussions with the UK Government. But I would encourage the Cabinet Secretary to take up the offer from the Base Secretary, Alok Sharma, to fully engage at ministerial level. Stakeholders in the economy require that of you, Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, while the common frameworks will form an important cornerstone of the internal market, they will not be sufficiently comprehensive to safeguard the operation of the entire UK internal market. Paragraph 21 of the White Paper makes this clear. Common frameworks tend to be sector-specific and cannot address the totality of economic regulation. That's why the third, I've given enough way, thank you. That's why the third area of powers coming to this Parliament will be through the internal market proposals. Under these proposals, additional powers will come to this Parliament in areas previously regulated by the EU, but which will now sit outside the common frameworks. The internal market proposals are based on two fundamental principles to support trade across the UK: mutual recognition and non-discrimination. The mutual recognition principle has been described by SPICE as reflecting the EU approach for goods by proposing that any goods which meet the rules and standards required in one of the UK's nations should, as a result, be able to be sold in any of the four nations. And earlier this week, the CBI welcomed these principles as being essential for business operating across the UK. The CBI has also highlighted that there will have to be a number of exemptions from the principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination in order to reflect regulatory divergence across the four nations on grounds of public policy, public health, environmental protection or otherwise. And again, I call on the Scottish Government to work constructively with the UK Government and business organisations to agree what those exemptions will apply to. Presiding Officer, the internal market proposals represent a dynamic approach to safeguarding the integrity of the UK internal market, while at the same time they safeguard the powers of devolved administrations to pursue competent policy divergence. In order to put this issue beyond any doubt, the White Paper expressly recognises that each devolved Parliament will continue to be able to legislate on a basis appropriate for its jurisdiction. Alok Sharma made this clear in the White Paper when he said that these principles will not undermine devolution. They will simply prevent any part of the UK from blocking products or services from another part while protecting devolved powers to innovate. I will if I've got time, Presiding Officer.
Minister General.
On the point about divergence, on page 82 of the White Paper, there's quite a contradiction there. It states that a diverging UK constituent part could increase regulatory requirements, imposing significant market-specific costs. This might discourage suppliers from entering the UK market. Is he saying honestly that everything's on the table, that the UK Government would not be dictating to the Scottish Parliament, for example, on minimum unit pricing? That's not up for grabs. Is that what he's saying? There's going to be divergence. It's all fine.
Dean Lockhart.
I find it difficult to pick my way through that question, Presiding Officer, but what I would say to Jenny Gruth, all the stakeholders are asking the Scottish Government to agree the key common frameworks which will apply in the key sectors, and you cannot do that if you don't constructively engage with the UK Government. Presiding Officer, let me address the question of dispute resolution and oversight, because there's some confusion on the SNP side about this as well. The UK Government is proposing an independent body, independent of all parliaments, which will have the responsibility to monitor and advise on the evolution of the internal market and provide expert guidance to devolved administrations. We agree that further clarity is required on this point, but the UK Government has made it clear that the advice of this independent body will not be legally binding on any of the devolved administrations. So claims made by the SNP that this independent body would prevent future regulatory divergence or policy innovation are simply not correct. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the SNP has accused the UK Government of taking a political, not economic approach to the internal market. But we all know it's the SNP who are approaching these proposals with political cynicism. Let's face it, the SNP has no interest in making a success of the UK internal market. It is, after all, their policy to separate from that market. We recognise that the internal market white paper does raise a number of questions, and the UK Government has committed to provide answers in short order. But the net effect of these proposals will be that 60% of Scotland's trade will be safeguarded in this time of economic crisis, and this Parliament will have more powers than ever. Powers the SNP want to hand straight back to Brussels in what would be the biggest power surrender in the history of this Parliament. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I call Alec Rowley to open for Labour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In moving the amendment in my name, I want to make a direct plea to the UK Government to recognise that any arrangements for the UK internal market must be reached by agreement between the four nations of the UK. The idea that the Westminster Government can and will force its point of view on the other three nations, regardless of what they think, is not just ridiculous, it will almost certainly build support against remaining part of the UK and lead to the ultimate breakup of the United Kingdom as we know it. Now, we know that Brexit is not going to be good for Scotland. The Tories talk today about 60% of Scotland's trade being with the rest of the UK and rightly point out that we need to protect this. But I would suggest that forcing your ideological will on another country is not the way to achieve this. It is also worth pointing out that the UK exports to the EU in 2018 were just over 45% of all exports. And so there are lots of risks involved with Brexit that the Tory benches just seem to have wiped out from their minds. Now, I understand that the Tories have a historical track record of being opposed to devolution, of being opposed to spreading wealth and power as widely as possible. But now it seems they want to dismantle the powers of devolution.
Dean Lockhart.
On Alex Rowley's point about devolution, does he not recognise the massive powers over the past decade that have been transferred by the UK Conservative Government to this Parliament? That's not open for debate. That's just a fact of life, Mr Rowley.
Alex Rowley.
What I would say to you is that the discussions on the common frameworks were progressing under Theresa May's leadership, but since Boris Johnson came into power, he has completely ditched that. Boris Johnson seems to have no respect for devolution and no respect for the governments of the other nation, and therefore that will lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom by Boris Johnson. But, Presiding Officer, in terms of devolution, don't take my word for it. The National Farmers Union in Scotland had this to say about the Tory plans, and I quote, "NFU Scotland supports the intention to ensure that the UK internal market continues to operate as it does now, with free movement of goods and services produced to the same basic regulatory standards. However, it is the clear view of NUFU Scotland and other farming unions of the UK that the proposals pose a significant threat to the development of common frameworks and to devolution. The proposal on mutual recognition raises the potential for common frameworks to be rendered meaningless. NFU Scotland is clear that common frameworks could provide a more effective alternative to manage divergence whilst respecting devolution and so enable the UK internal market to operate without friction or distortion." And the NFU go on to say the UK internal market proposals appear to limit the devolved administration's ability to act if any standards were lowered and give the UK government a final say in areas of devolved policy such as agriculture, the environment or animal health and welfare. Now, I don't think that NFU are playing politics or trying to play constitutional politics. I think they are saying what is right for their members and what is right for the majority of the people of Scotland. The Tories are not only trying to undermine devolution, they are actually trying to roll back devolution, and that cannot under any circumstances be allowed to happen. And it is not just in agriculture that there are concerns. Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems state, and I quote, "The UK Government's proposed approach to the UK internal market is deeply concerning. It is apparently at wide scope to the commitment to frictionless trade risks undermining the ability of devolved administrations to effectively implement important public health measures amid a meeting that needs and protecting the health of the local population." So these are not organisations playing politics. These are organisations that are warning that this legislation will be damaging for Scotland. I also thought it was interesting, Presiding Officer, that the Royal Society of Edinburgh, in a brief it circulated, welcomed the 3 key objectives set out in the White Paper, namely continuing to secure economic opportunities across the UK, competitiveness enabling citizens to be in an environment that is the best place in the world to do business, and to provide for the general welfare, prosperity and economic security of its citizens. You might say, what is there not to like about those objectives? But they go on to state, and I quote, "The RSE is not convinced that the legislation proposed in the White Paper is required to achieve these objectives." I agree, and that is why we are supporting the Scottish Government's motion today. And to be clear, yes, we require to work across all 4 nations to agree a much stronger institutional framework for the development and enhancement of the UK internal market. But this will not be achieved through this White Paper and the proposed legislation coming from the Westminster Tory government. And that's why it should be withdrawn. There are many organisations across Scotland raising concerns, and they all need to be listened to. Another area highlighted by the group Radical Options for Scotland and Europe is the powers of this Parliament to be able to give financial assistance to commercial activities for the purpose of promoting or sustaining economic development and employment are at risk. I thought the statement from RSE on the subsidiarity and proportionality was fitting to finish, Presiding Officer. They state the principles of subsidiarity, that action should be taken at the most local level, practical, and proportionality, that this action should only be broad enough to achieve its aims and no more, are important mechanisms of the European single market in countering the accusation of centralisation. No such principles currently exist in the UK or in relation to devolution. If a legislative solution is needed for the UK internal market, then the RSE advocates including subsidiarity and proportionality as the mechanisms for guarding against inappropriate UK-wide legislation which would damage the devolved settlement. So the Tories must think again. If you want to damage the United Kingdom beyond recognition, then continue with the actions and continue to support Boris Johnson.
Call Patrick Harvey, please, to speak to and move Amendment 22437.4. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, and I'd like to welcome Alex Rowley's speech there, in particular the last point that suggested that if the Tories do want to damage the United Kingdom, they should just batter on with this plan of theirs at the moment. I'll come back to that at the end, because there is perhaps a glimmer of hope there for some of us. I welcome the fact that we're having this debate. I don't welcome at all the fact that we were unable to have this debate during the window of consultation that the UK government set out, because one of the main concerns that I put into my own amendment, which I move now, Presiding Officer, is the concern over the process and timing of this incredibly brief consultation. The White Paper on the UK internal market raises broad and complex issues. And the idea that we not only have just a 4-week window of consultation for this contentious and complex area of policy, but that 4 weeks is timed almost perfectly to coincide with the parliamentary recesses of this Parliament, of the Welsh Parliament and of the Northern Ireland Assembly is simply extraordinary. I don't think the voice from the side there suggesting it's a remarkable coincidence, I don't think that's believable. I don't think it's believable that this is entirely a coincidence. I think it's very clearly an intentional decision of the UK government. They know that this will be contentious in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. There are strong political voices coming, including from unionists in Wales, strongly opposed to the measures that are being proposed. It's perfectly obvious that that would be the reaction, and yet they've chosen deliberately to time this 4-week window of consultation at a period that almost entirely covers those 3 recesses. And Alok Sharma, the Minister, the Secretary of State responsible for this white paper, was invited on the one day that this Parliament had to take evidence at committee, in the Finance and Constitution Committee, he was invited to give evidence by the video conference and refused. The man had been in Glasgow just the week before. He's willing to travel here for other purposes, but he's not even willing to take part in an hour-and-a-half video conference with the Parliamentary Committee to start answering questions about why his plan should be held up, can be held up to scrutiny. This is an extraordinary level of contempt for the parliamentary process. And even PACAC, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee at Westminster, said this 1-month consultation is not proportionate to the importance of the issues dealt with. Even a parliamentary committee with a Conservative majority at Westminster made that clear. And they went on, as others have, to talk about the importance, the substance of what's actually included. They said that proposals will effectively create new reservations in areas of devolved competence. Will create new reservations in areas of devolved competence. This flies 100% in the face of the commitments that were given in the wake of the Brexit referendum by supporters of the Brexit project, saying that coming out of Europe would lead to powers transferring wholesale. With no new reservations, they said. Well, there will be new reservations. And the government, that PACAC continues, should indicate whether, in such circumstances, it would intend to overwrite the Sewell Convention. I think the UK government needs to do more than merely indicate whether they intend to do that. I think they need to give a cast-iron guarantee that it will not be done, because it would be utterly unacceptable to Scottish democracy. And the RSE paper as well, which has been referred to, sets out serious objections to the substance of what's proposed. The RSE, it says, is not convinced that the legislation proposed is required to achieve even the UK government's own outcomes. They say any outcome which sees the Sewell Convention being overridden must be considered a failure of intergovernmental relations. And they say the expectation should be that on leaving the EU, any areas of law no longer subject to the preemptive effect of EU law and which do not fall into the reserved category should go to the devolved level. That would be the clear expectation that anyone, and Mr Lockhart, who's cast his party as the supreme defenders of devolution, despite having already passed legislation to cut the powers of this Parliament without this Parliament's consent, is all set to do it again. I give way.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you to Patrick Harvey for summarising my speech. Maybe he should write my speeches in the future. He is a strong believer in devolution and local powers, but does Patrick Harvey, like the SNP, want to hand all of these additional powers coming to this Parliament straight back to Brussels? Yeah.
Patrick Harvey.
I absolutely want Scotland to be a full member of the European Union with a vote and a voice in a democratic assembly, which is a lot more democratic and open than the Westminster one is. Presiding Officer, my colleagues in the Green parties in Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales have joined together to put in a response. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that in the discussions that led to that response being developed, many in the Green Party of England and Wales, not just in relation to Wales, but in relation to functions that are exercised at a lower than UK level within England as well, functions exercised by elected mayors and by local governments, also share the concern that any decisions that they have the power to make, which could be subject to even a spurious challenge by the private sector, saying this will create a barrier to trade, those powers will also be at risk, not just those in devolution. This is absolutely an assault on our Parliament here, however, and any passage of this legislation without the consent of this Parliament would, I would say, be a very clear breach of Section 28(8) of the Scotland Act as amended. And I urge the Scottish Government, if that happens, not just to oppose it, but to challenge it in court. Because if, in the context of clear alternatives through common frameworks by negotiation and clear evidence that this legislation is not necessary, surely we have to be able to challenge the idea that the UK government is acting within the parameters of that not normally. It's time that we had the courts define what that means and limit the power of the UK government to legislate in devolved matters without our consent. I move the amendment in my name, Presiding Officer, and I look forward to hearing more from the passionate defenders of devolution about why they intend to continue ripping up the settlement.
Call Willie Rennie, please, to speak to and move amendment 22437.2 for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. I want to start by endorsing the view of the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution. In their letter to Lord Callanan last month on the White Paper, in which they said this: "We are not convinced about the need to legislate for the UK internal market, and we are unsure precisely what problems the White Paper is seeking to solve." The White Paper is a confusing jumble of proposals that chases around problems that don't really exist in the current internal market and refuses to take the opportunity to establish a modern system of joint decision-making between the four administrations to protect the market going forward. It is disappointing that the UK Government has not been able or willing to give joint ministerial decision-making the place that it should have under the decentralised Constitution. This was one of the constructive proposals made by the Smith Commission, which I do recall included Conservative members back in 2015, when it said the joint ministerial committee structures must be reformed as a matter of urgency and scaled up significantly. Scotland should not be left with a choice between a UK Conservative administration intent on centralising decision-making in Whitehall and a nationalist government in Edinburgh that is prepared to erect formal trade and business borders between Scotland and England. Each approach will harm Scottish and UK interests. There is an opportunity to do better than this. I would urge the UK Government to withdraw the current White Paper and enact a federal-style approach to future decisions on the UK internal market. The White Paper quotes the examples of Australia and Switzerland, which are both constitutionally federal states. In Australia, the different governments of the states and territories agreed in the early 1990s to adopt a mutual recognition system, and they all passed legislation to allow that to happen. In the UK, all administrations should be involved in taking the decisions. Working together, we would be able to protect the workings of the UK single market from what would be, in effect, unilateral action by a single administration. This is a federal idea of cooperation, and it contrasts with the proposals in the White Paper, which appear to give control of these issues entirely to UK ministers. Now, I'm grateful to the National Farmers Union of Scotland, hardly the bastion of nationalism, for writing such a clear and distinct case against the White Paper. They set out the damage that the present White Paper proposals will bring. The NFU is clear that it wants no new barriers to trade in the UK, and it wants collaboration across the United Kingdom. Neither the Conservatives' centralisation plans nor the SNP's independence plans can achieve both of these things. People and businesses in Scotland deserve better than a choice between these two unpalatable and destructive options. My amendment today gives a way forward. I want to see overarching frameworks progressed and agreed between the four administrations. I want joint ministerial committees to be up and running with a dispute resolution process to keep things moving. Once the frameworks have been agreed by all four, then the detailed implementation can be left to the individual administrations, safe in the knowledge that the fundamentals of the internal market are protected. Amendments to support this style of working in Scotland were proposed by my former colleague Tavish Scott as part of the continuity legislation back in the spring of 2018. There was some support from Conservative members at that time. SNP ministers were less keen because they would clearly prefer to take unilateral decisions within Scotland and do not prioritise the continuation of an internal UK market. Their plans for independence bring an automatic border that will damage trade and business in all parts of the United Kingdom. But the Conservatives here today need to recognise that the United Kingdom has changed. The authority and power rests in the nations and regions of the UK. That not all power should or must rest in Westminster and Whitehall. That there is a legitimate voice in all parts of the United Kingdom, and that voice must be heard. Thank you.
We now move on to the open debate, and we're already a bit short of time, so if I could ask speakers to stick to 6 minutes or less, please. And I call Bruce Crawford to be followed by Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be taking part in this important debate today on the proposals in the UK Government's White Paper on the internal market. Obviously, I'm not making my contribution as the convener of the Finance and Constitution Committee. However, the views of the committee were laid out in a letter to the UK Government last week. The committee made it clear they opposed the direction of travel of the UK Government, and I believe the conclusions reached by the committee were mature and reasonable. They represented a genuine spirit of trying to secure agreement on the best way forward across the four nations of the United Kingdom. But can I say to Dean Lockhart and the Tories, those of us on those benches need no lesson on the importance and benefit to Scotland of barrier-free trade with the rest of the UK. How could it be otherwise, given the obvious fact that Scotland conducts the majority of its trade with the rest of the UK? No one could seriously oppose the intention of ensuring the UK market continues to operate in a similar fashion as it does now. But make no mistake, the proposals the Tory government have laid out in their white paper pose a serious and direct threat by potentially introducing friction and distortion to the market. Dean Lockhart.
Dean Lockhart.
Bruce Crawford said he was concerned about barriers between Scotland and the rest of the UK, but that's precisely what the SNP's EU Continuity Bill will deliver. Because if Scottish companies are forced to comply with EU regulations and UK-wide regulations at the same time, that will create a barrier between trade between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Does it not recognise that?
Bruce Crawford.
Well, let me come to the real barriers in just a minute about where the barriers really exist. Well, yes, I do, and it will come. Of course, it is the Tory government who are intent on creating new barriers to free trade for Scotland by removing us from the largest internal market in the world. It's the Tories who are intent on removing the people of Scotland, against their will, from a free market of around £450 million, and instead impose on Scotland's exporters trade barriers, complete with tariffs and border controls, with 27 new countries. Exports to 27 countries that are worth, according to the Fraser-Allender Institute, and I'll say a bit more about them because they're obviously a keen thing that the Tories want to talk about, of over £16 billion. Now, of course, if you dig deeper down into export numbers, you find even more revealing truths. As the Fraser-Allender Institute also demonstrated, in February this year, Scotland actually exports more manufactured products, that's products that are exportable over international borders, to countries outside the UK than it does to the rest of the UK. So what's absolutely clear, therefore, it's the Tories who are creating barriers to free trade by removing Scotland from the EU, as well as through their ideological thirst for centralised control laid out in the White Paper. So too, their proposals pose a significant threat to the development of common frameworks and to devolution. Not my words, not the words of an SNP Cabinet Secretary or Minister, but the words of the National Farmers Union of Scotland. Actually, the views of the NFUS very much chime with those of the Finance and Constitution Committee, and are worth quoting, like Alec Rowley and Willie Rennie have already done so. They say since 2017, Common Work Frameworks process is intended to specifically manage policy differences between all parts of the UK based on agreement and founded on respect for devolution. However, the UK internal market proposals put forward limit the devolved administration's ability to act if any standards were lowered and give the UK government a final say in areas of devolved policy such as agriculture, the environment and animal health and welfare. There we have it, the threats clearly laid out. And let me turn to a specific threat to Scotland's reputation for clean, green food production. Let me take an example provided to the Finance and Constitution Committee by Professor Dugan from the University of Liverpool. In regards to the principle of mutual recognition proposals in the White Paper, he said, "Any good that is lawfully sold or service which is lawfully provided in Territory X should be allowed to be lawfully sold provided also in Territories Y and Z, without having to comply with any further standards, checks or requirements in the host country." He goes on to say, Territory X might ban the production of GMOs within its own borders, but it cannot stop the imposition of GMOs which have been lawfully produced in Territory Y. Given that the growth and sale of genetically modified organisms are permitted in England and Wales but opposed in Scotland, here we have a clear and very real threat to the clean green status of Scotland's multi-billion-pound food and drug sector, as well as the wider threat presented to agriculture, environment and animal health and welfare. For goodness sake, even the Public Administration and Constitution Affairs Committee at Westminster, chaired by a Tory majority, said it effectively creates new reservations in areas of devolved competence. Therefore, at the end of the day, the central question for the Scottish Tories is, will you stand with the majority to defend devolution and protect Scotland's interests? Or will history show you to be simply Boris Johnson's little helpers in Scotland? Thank you.
Adam Tompkins, please, to be followed by John McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Parliament has competence to make laws that have the potential to interfere with all manner of aspects of trade and market access in goods and services. We could, as we've heard, make public health rules that restrict access to goods. We could make food labelling rules that impose additional costs on manufacturers. We could impose additional regulatory requirements on professions or services. All of these are within our devolved competence. Until now, our exercise of these powers has not disrupted or threatened the integrity of the UK's internal market, because all of these powers have had to be exercised subject to EU law. An EU internal market law, which has of course bound every part of the UK since the dawn of devolution, has acted as a check on the exercise by the Scottish Parliament of its powers over trade, markets, goods and services. When we leave the transition period at the end of this year, that check will disappear. And at that point, exercise of devolved competence could, for the first time, disrupt or threaten the integrity of the UK's internal market. And this would be contrary not only to the UK's interests, it would be contrary to the interests of Scottish consumers, producers, manufacturers and distributors, much as Bruce Crawford just said. Scotland, let us not forget, trades 1.5 times as much with the rest of the UK as it does with the whole of the EU and the rest of the world put together. And the UK's internal market is worth nearly 4 times as much to Scots as the EU's single market is. So no one, whether unionist or nationalist, should imagine that it is in their interests to erect new barriers to trade between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Now, not at the moment. Over the course of the last few years, a series of so-called common frameworks has been developed which aim to address this problem. But these are not legal instruments, and in any event, they do not cover the whole of the field. Necessary and welcome though they are, I've always been of the view that without legal underpinning, they were unlikely on their own to be sufficient. And to provide that legal underpinning, guaranteeing the future integrity of the UK internal market is what the UK government is now proposing. I warmly welcome this. In my view, we all should. As I've said, it's in no one's interests for Scotland's unimpeded access to markets in the rest of the UK to be disrupted. However, not at the moment, however, I have a number of reservations about the way in which the UK government is currently proposing to legislate in this area. Common frameworks are based on two principles: to enable the functioning of the UK internal market and, at the same time, to acknowledge legitimate policy difference. And this is critical, it seems to me. It's perfectly possible, and moreover, it's surely desirable, to accommodate regulatory divergence within a single market. And let's take alcohol minimum pricing as an example, which has been used by a number of other speakers already this afternoon. If one part of the UK considers that for reasons of public health it wants to impose a measure such as this, but other parts of the UK consider it to be unnecessary, this regulatory divergence within a single market, this is regulatory divergence within a single market for sure. But is the divergence so severe or disruptive that it threatens the very integrity of that market? Now, of course, we don't want such severe divergence that access to the market becomes unreasonably burdensome. But many regulatory differences can be managed without burdens becoming too severe. It's all about balance. And in European law, and indeed in legal systems right around the world, that balance is achieved by the all-important doctrine of proportionality, which Alec Rowley talked about rightly earlier this afternoon. Proportionate interferences with market access, as minimum unit pricing was found by the courts to be, are lawful as falling within the scope of legitimate policy difference. It's only when regulatory divergence is disproportionate that it becomes unlawful. So we have two principles at stake here, both important: safeguarding the integrity of the internal market and protecting legitimate policy divergence, or, if you want to express that second one differently, protecting devolution. The UK government's internal market white paper puts a lot of flesh on the bones of the former, but says next to nothing about the latter. The two core policies of the white paper proposes, mutual recognition and non-discrimination, will indeed strengthen and safeguard the UK internal market. And they are well known to anyone who knows anything about internal market law. They're very well-established principles of European law. They're coherent, practicable, sensible, and the white paper is, in my view, quite right to want to promote them. But they need to be balanced, presiding officer, by other equally well-understood policies that promote and protect our second principle, the safeguarding of legitimate policy divergence. And the best tool we have to do that work is the doctrine of proportionality, as developed not only by the European courts, but by courts right across the Commonwealth and beyond. Proportionality should not be understood, presiding officer, as an alien notion of foreign law that has no roots in our own common law traditions. It is as much part of our legal heritage as it is of anyone else's. And it is, presiding officer, much more than mere policy. It is legal doctrine enforceable by courts of law. So in conclusion, presiding officer, the UK government is, in my view, absolutely right to understand that our departure from the EU means that we do need to take steps, including legislative steps, to underscore, strengthen and safeguard the UK's internal market. This can readily be achieved compatibly with our devolution settlement, and it must be achieved compatibly with devolution. In order to get there, we need to ensure that our new internal market law enshrines not only mutual recognition and non-discrimination as foundational legal principles, but also the doctrine of proportionality. That way, we can safeguard the internal market and protect legitimate policy divergence all at once. Thank you.
Joan McAlpine will be followed by Jackie Bailey. Ms McAlpine.
Thank you very much, presiding officer. Only a government with contempt for democratic decision-making could have produced the internal market white paper proposals, and there is nothing proportionate about these plans. I say that not just because of its attack on this Parliament, which the Minister and the convener of the Finance and Constitution Committee have already outlined. The contempt for devolution in the UK government paper is indiscriminate, and it seeks to misrepresent any devolved system. Take, for example, paragraph 85 of the white paper. In grasping for an illustration to justify its power grab, The UK government used the very unlikely example of Germany, but it claims there are trade costs between the Länder. Now, Germany has one of the most successful federal systems in the world, and I say that as someone who wants more than federalism for Scotland, but it's widely understood and admired that Germany has one of the best federal systems in the world, and Länder like Lower Saxony and Bavaria are economic powerhouses. And all German Länder have, of course, access to the largest free trade zone in the world, the European single market, an advantage being stripped away from Scotland. So that misrepresentation of German federalism in paragraph 85 has not been as widely publicised as it should have been, but it seems to me to sum up the absolute absurdity and inaccuracy of the white paper, which is based not on fact and analysis, but on ignorance and ideology. When I looked for a reference to justify the nonsense claim that German states are crippled by internal trade barriers, there was no evidence at all, and the footnote said that the comparison and modelling was hypothetical. Presiding officer, hypothetical could describe the entire contents of this white paper. It's also mendacious. It draws a false comparison between the European single market and something it calls the UK internal market. Others have quoted the Royal Society of Edinburgh paper released ahead of this debate, highlighted by Alec Rowley and others, which outlines the difference between the two very different systems, the EU single market and this so-called internal market. And it bears repeating for that reason. The Royal Society points out that European single market treaties enshrine the principles of subsidiarity, that action should be taken at the most local level practicable, and proportionality, that this action should only be broad enough to achieve its aims. No such principles of subsidiarity or proportionality currently exist in the UK. The Royal Society also pointed out that free trade operates smoothly across the UK already without the need for the legislation proposed in the White Paper. As I said before, this assault on devolution is unnecessary and ideologically driven. The anti-European extremists who chanted to take back control are now imposing command and control from London. In the EU, Scotland was afforded the same discretion in interpreting EU regulations and implementing EU directives as a member state. By contrast, the White Paper means any law made by this Parliament in a devolved area could be challenged, as Ms Gilruth has outlined. Even areas of Scottish legislation which predate devolution are at risk, such as building control. The White Paper actually says, if England and Scotland diverged in their approach to building regulations, it would become significantly more difficult for construction firms to design and plan projects effectively across the UK. Presiding officer, these differences already exist, and for very good reasons. There are traditional differences, of course, between building needs in England and Scotland, such as weather, building materials, topography, and tradition. But there's also a very contemporary need to improve standards. In the wake of the terrible Grenfell fire, both the UK and the Scottish Government brought forward proposals to regulate the use of combustible material in new buildings. The new safety certifications in Scotland are more wide-ranging. In England, the new regulations apply to new residential buildings with a storey at 18 metres above ground, and by comparison, the new standards in Scotland will apply to buildings with a storey of 11 metres above ground level. And that's just one of the significant differences. No doubt there will be developers who don't like that, but a big developer grumbling about a safety measure is no barrier to trade. Under the UK Government proposals, they could go to court to stop the Scottish Government protecting its citizens in this way. Presiding officer, before I finish, I wanted to comment on the Labour amendment. The power to subsidise key sectors of the economy is currently reserved, and this law will snatch that power away. Professor Michael Keating made this clear in committee last year when he pointed out that state aid was reserved in the unsuccessful Scotland Act of 1978, which some might remember, but not reserved in the Scotland Act of 1998, 20 years later, which of course established the powers of this Parliament. Professor Keating observed, and I quote, "Somebody must have known what they were doing." That somebody in 1998 was the late Donald Dewar, the First Minister of this Parliament. Mr Dewar deliberately devolved state aid because he knew that one of the biggest drivers of devolution was the mass industrial closures and control of key industries that Scotland had seen for the 20 preceding years. When Scotland's sea powers designed to protect them against a repeat of Thatcherite vandalism being snatched away from Scotland's Parliament by the anti-European Thatcherite children, they will not remain quiet, Presiding Officer. This white paper is the greatest ever threat to devolution and is also the greatest threat to the Union, and the Tories will reap what they sow. Thank you very much.
Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I understand and even sympathise with many of the issues that Mike Russell has raised within his motion. And we will, of course, be supporting the Greens and the Lib Dem amendments, because this is an incredibly uncertain time for business and for our economy as we approach Brexit. It's not something I voted for, but whatever your view, any proposals that come forward which have an effect on how business, industry and devolved nations operate must be fully consulted on and must be fully scrutinised. I echo many of the concerns raised by my Labour colleagues in this chamber, at Westminster and in the Welsh Labour government too. Because the UK Internal Market White Paper has a significant number of flaws, both in terms of its content and the manner in which it has been consulted on. And I, along with fellow colleagues in the Finance and Constitution Committee, expressed regret that the proposals within this white paper were published during the Scottish Parliament's recess, and even more frustratingly, only 4 weeks were allowed for consultation to take place. Indeed, the members of the Welsh Assembly's Legislation, Justice and Constitution Committee described this time frame as wholly inadequate. I suspect they were being polite, Presiding Officer. But it is completely unjustifiable to allow for such little consultation to take place for legislation which does have such momentous repercussions. It was also very unhelpful and, I have to say, disappointing that Alok Sharma declined the committee's invitation to provide evidence, because his comments would have helped to inform our response to the consultation. On the morning that the committee was actually taking evidence on the white paper, he told us he couldn't come. So it would have been helpful for us to have been able to explore the policy objectives underpinning the proposals with the Minister, and I'm sure that the views that would have been submitted had the Minister taken time to meet with us would have benefited from a reflection upon his comments. Unfortunately, no such opportunity was given to us. For this proposal to progress further, we do need better, more transparent and formal consultation. We need better involvement. Without it, the market will not function effectively in support of the 4 UK nations, which I think is ultimately what we all desire. But we do need cooperation and consensus, not a high-handed take-it-or-leave-it approach. And where I do agree with the UK government is that a solution to the challenge of a UK internal market is needed. But this solution must be arrived at with the full consideration and input of the devolved nations within the UK. And I've repeatedly stressed the need for full cooperation between Scotland and the UK over a range of different things in general terms. And I much prefer consensus rather than standoffs, because I don't think it helps anybody to do that. But I also have repeatedly stressed the need for cooperation with all 4 nations, in particular about this decision-making process to arrive at agreed frameworks for the internal market. But we don't know what mechanisms are going to be put in place to enable and promote that cross-administration cooperation. And it is essential that we know exactly how the legislative bodies of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and England all work together, so that we can be sure that devolved powers are not undermined. Can I commend the suggestion of my Welsh colleagues that any plans for a UK internal market post-Brexit must include an independent oversight framework and a dispute resolution mechanism. Once again, I don't see signs of these suggestions manifesting themselves, which in turn creates further uncertainty in a situation where certainty and confidence is a must. Having a proper UK-wide and independent disputes mechanism does actually go a long way in providing the protection and reassurance needed by devolved administrations, which currently is missing within this white paper. Now, the Labour Party at UK level and indeed in Scotland has consistently called for devolved nations to be protected within any legislative change to the internal market. We created this Scottish Parliament. We respect and support devolved administrations and the devolved settlement. It is paramount, therefore, that the standards within any post-Brexit settlement are no lower than the current standards enjoyed by devolved nations under EU membership. Administration should be able to move beyond such standards, but should not be allowed to go below them. Similarly, current state aid rules must be mirrored in any new legislation. Devolved nations have to be able to provide support to industries where it is deemed necessary. And at a UK level and in Scotland, we have called for better consultation, a UK-wide disputes resolution mechanism, something indeed akin to like a European Court of Justice. But whatever the solution, we do need to arrive at it together. So I do think plans for the current formulation in the white paper do need to be withdrawn. Where I depart from Mike Russell's view is that I do think we do need plans to legislate for the future. The key issue, though, is what is in them. And I don't think the white paper in its current form is fit for purpose. So we know a number of issues need to be addressed, which possibly would have been addressed had the government allowed for a proper period of consultation and dialogue. But above all, the interests of the devolved nations must be respected. Presiding Officer, that's not currently the case. The UK Conservative government need to respect the devolved settlement across all 4 nations if they wish to succeed in creating the conditions for an effective and robust internal market.
Call Tom Arthur to be followed by Peter Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to say a few words in this debate. I thought it was very useful in the opening when the Minister, Jenny Gilruth, brought us back to the dawn of devolution, as Adam Tompkins described it in 1997, because I think there's sometimes when we discuss devolution and the referendum in 1997, there's a slight oversight that we're all guilty of, which is that people down in Scotland did not just vote for devolution within the United Kingdom, but devolution within the United Kingdom and the European Union. That was clearly understood. And that was a position reaffirmed by the people of Scotland in 2014 and in 2016. So when we consider the question of where the drafters of the Scotland Act 1998, ignorant of the possibility of a potential where Scotland could leave, or the UK could leave the European Union, and therefore powers that would automatically flow back to this Parliament should not flow back to this Parliament, we have to remember the circumstances in which people of Scotland voted for devolution. It was devolution within the UK and within the European Union. And what we face now with these proposals from the UK government is a fundamental threat to that settlement that was agreed in 1997, legislated for in 1998, brought into effect in 1999 and has been enhanced since. There's a direct undermining where powers that should flow back to this Parliament have been frozen and taken to Westminster. But there's also an indirect threat emanating from the proposals for a UK internal market. And that is to effectively render aspects of legislation within this Parliament meaningless through a mechanism of mutual recognition or the market access principle. And that's of grave concern to me, and it's of grave concern to many across Scotland, as we've heard this afternoon, because fundamentally a mutual recognition principle has the potential to be a Trojan horse. Regardless of what standards we choose to set in Scotland, we will be ultimately at the mercy of what standards are set elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And this comes back to a fundamental problem, I think, in seeking to transpose the language of the European single market into the notion of a UK internal market. And that's very simply that England, as a jurisdiction, makes up 85% of the UK population. So I think in such scenarios, in this scenario, that it's not a straightforward transposition. Now, I think what the aspiration should be, and I think this has been touched on by Alex Rowley, it has been touched on by Willie Rennie and indeed by Adam Tompkins, is to ensure that there are sufficient checks and balances. Now, I think the way in which perhaps agreement could be found is to be moving towards a position of co-decision making, of making this Parliament not subservient or subsidiary, but a sovereign equal to the Parliament at Westminster. I believe for people who support the Union, that would be a state of affairs that could command support. And I think it's one that, for those of us who want to go further and see Scotland become independent, it's one we could at least accept just now. But I think, as we have heard from the comments of Alex Rowley and others, that to approach in a way, for the UK Government to take an approach which is effectively imposition, to seek to render aspects of devolution meaningless, will lead to increased support for independence, because it will give the people of Scotland a clear sense of what the UK's direction is, which is to no longer be a union state, but a unitary state. The debates over the nature of the union have been going on for over 300 years, whether it was to be an incorporating union or something that we would more now say approximates a federal solution. But the proposals coming from the UK Government and the attitude and the conduct of the UK Government over recent years following Brexit has signalled not only a lack of understanding of what the union historically was for many unionists, which was a partnership, but something fundamentally different, which is about incorporation and undermining of Scottish autonomy. So I think that the way we can take this forward, if we want to take it forward collectively as a Parliament, is to at least try and agree on some principles, which is one is no rollback of devolution. And I've heard from Willie Rennie and from Alex Rowley that while our parties may disagree on how far down the road of constitutional change we want to go, we're absolutely sure that we don't want to go backwards. And that is a position which will command the majority of support from people across Scotland. We know right now that, and I think we would all concede, even opponents of independence, that were there to be an independence referendum tomorrow, the likelihood is that Scotland would vote to become independent. It certainly is by no means certain. But if we were to go and ask people where they think powers should lie across the United Kingdom on decisions relevant to Scotland, the kind of decisions we're talking about that flow as a consequence from Brexit, there would be an overwhelming majority of people in Scotland would want these powers to be in this Parliament. And I recognise that for Mr Lockhart, he has a job to do in standing up there as his party spokesperson and defend a position. But I would just remind him, he, like I and everyone else here, is a member of the Scottish Parliament. And we have a duty and an obligation on behalf of our constituents to defend the powers of this Parliament and not see them rolled back. And the proposals of the UK Government threaten to do exactly that.
I call Peter Chapman to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And the EU defines its internal market as an area without internal frontiers in which the free movement of goods, persons, services and capital is ensured. The UK Internal Market White Paper proposes the very same principles in order to protect the internal market of the UK, allowing for the unrestricted movement of goods and services between the four nations of the United Kingdom. So I do really wonder why so many speakers today find it acceptable and are ready to and willing to accept these basic principles of an internal market from a parliament in a foreign country, rather than our own parliament on these very islands. The White Paper set out by the UK Government encompasses two important principles of any internal market. Firstly, mutual recognition, meaning the production of goods and services in one part of the UK are recognised as being as good as the goods and services in any other part of the UK. And secondly, non-discrimination, which outlines that it is not possible for one regulatory system to introduce rules specifically discriminating against goods or services from another. Now, Presiding Officer, these two principles are also evident in the EU single market legislation. So again, I ask, why are members here quite happy to accept these exact same principles from Brussels, but won't accept them from Westminster? Exactly. And let's not forget that this bill will allow, and is about, proportionate divergence, as explained so expertly by Adam Tompkins, my colleague behind me today. Not just now. Presiding Officer, over 60% of Scotland's exports go to the rest of the UK. In what world would a Scottish government of any hue not see the value in protecting trade with its largest and most profitable export market? It is absolutely clear that the Scottish Government is doing its usual tactic of faux outrage, constitutional grandstanding and grievance politics. And I say to the Cabinet Secretary, do what is right for Scotland, not what your narrow separation politics demand. And start engaging constructively with the UK Government in order to safeguard the economy and protect jobs, rather than playing the usual constitutional games. If the Cabinet Secretary and the wider Scottish Government is unable, or more probably unwilling to do this, it should come clean with the Scottish people and admit that its raison d'etre is separation at all costs. Presiding Officer, there is an unassailable economic argument for an internal UK market, one that the Scottish Government's own White Paper on Independence acknowledged in 2013, stating the need for, and I quote, a fully integrated market with products able to be bought and sold freely across Scotland and the rest of the UK. The proposals put forward by the UK Government create certainty for businesses that might otherwise have faced a complex and increasingly fragmented regulatory environment. Indeed, the SNP's own stated intention is to follow EU rules and regulations to the letter in years to come, in the vain hope that an independent Scotland can rejoin the EU. So it's very obvious that barriers to trade in the UK could very quickly become problematic. It is incredible that anyone at a time of the greatest economic uncertainty in living memory that the Scottish Government is willing to go against the needs of Scottish businesses and put at risk over 500,000 jobs that are reliant on frictionless trade with the rest of the UK. Presiding Officer, I am absolutely astounded that the SNP is prepared to sacrifice so many Scottish jobs to further its divisive party politics. The members of the SNP stoke fears of so-called power grab and the threat to devolution. The UK Government has made it absolutely crystal clear that all powers that have been devolved will remain devolved. The UK Government has always been a strong supporter of devolution, believing that decisions should be made at the level closest to the citizen they affect. I will.
Bruce Crawford.
In that case, then, does Peter Chapman agree or disagree with the National Farmers Union of Scotland, who say this is not only a threat to devolution, but a threat to the market in the United Kingdom and a threat to Scotland?
Peter Chapman.
I do disagree with the NFUS, and I normally respect their views, but they've got it wrong on this occasion. So I'm sorry, they have. The SNP's own website says that to protect Scotland's interests, the Scottish Parliament should receive substantial new powers. Well, I like to deliver good news. It's getting 111 of them. Yay. And I have another question for the SNP. Of these 111 new powers, are there any of them that the Scottish Government does not want? No. Obviously no answer. We all know that if the SNP have their way, they would give all these powers back to Brussels in a blink. So how big a power grab would that be, ladies and gentlemen? Exactly. Our fishermen desperately want out of the CFP, and our farmers can have a better future out of the CAP. And I remind Parliament of my register of interests. So who is the Cabinet Secretary willing to betray first, our farmers or our fishermen? Presiding Officer, this legislation adds a whole new raft of powers to what is one of the strongest devolved parliaments anywhere in the world. It is not a lack of powers that the Scottish Government suffers from, but a lack of ambition and talent to use the ones already at its disposal. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Chapman. I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Ms Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be called to speak in this debate this afternoon. And just briefly in response to Mr Chapman, what is absolutely astonishing at this time of great economic uncertainty in the midst of a global pandemic is that the UK Tory government wishes to take us off a cliff edge in just over 4 months. That is what is astonishing, Mr Chapman. But turning to the consultation paper, it was, I think, a consultation paper with a period of just 4 weeks for comments. And of course, it was published on 16th July. So I would argue it was sneaked out during the summer holiday period. And it was quite clear why they would seek to sneak it out. For the propositions being put forward in the white paper represent the biggest threat to our reconvened Scottish Parliament that we have ever seen. And perhaps I could start with the UK government's desire to legislate for what they term to be the UK internal market. That there is already a market across these aisles is beyond doubt. As the 31 December Brexit shambles date looms ever larger for Scotland, when we will be dragged out of the EU against our will by the UK Tory government, the EU single market rules will thereafter no longer have direct effect in Scots law. But what the UK Tory government is proposing to do is to take all powers in those areas for itself, even those devolved to the Scottish Parliament. The UK government is proposing to do this without any mechanism for agreement with Scotland and indeed the other devolved nations as to the rules going forward, and with no fair and effective mechanism for dispute resolution built in, which would give individual remedies to citizens and businesses and so on. The UK government talks of the principle of non-discrimination, which is odd because it's a legal term of art that normally refers to relations with independent third countries, but it refers to that principle and the principle of proportionality as underpinning its approach. But perhaps I can just pause there, Presiding Officer, to compare and contrast with the status quo. In fact, the EU single market is based on international agreement amongst equal nations who all sit at the top table and have a vote in determining the rules. The proposed UK internal market legislation, on the other hand, is based solely on London determining the rules. The EU single market provides for a minimum harmonisation of standards set at a high bar, which must then be mutually recognised by all member states. The proposed UK internal market legislation, on the other hand, assumes a race to the bottom in terms of standards and proposes, in effect, a one-way system of mutual recognition, London's way or the highway. The EU single market allows member states to invoke exceptions in certain circumstances, example being public policy, public health protection, and so on. And in the event of a dispute, these can be tested in the courts with the ECJ as referee. The proposed UK white paper the proposals in the UK white paper, on the other hand, are based on London removing Scotland's right to invoke legitimate protections, and also, indeed, London removing the referee. From Scotland's perspective, what on earth is there to like about these proposals? It is as if the Tories hope that by bulldozing this through, they can pretend that devolution never happened, that the people of Scotland never voted in significant numbers for more control over their own affairs, and that our Scottish Parliament was not in fact reconvened by my mother, Winnie Ewing, who famously said at the time, the Scottish Parliament adjourned on the 25th day of March in the year 1707 is hereby reconvened. But, Presiding Officer, to make a nod to the late, great Camden Keenan Wright, we are the people and we say no. For the UK government's proposals are unconstitutional, they are incoherent as a matter of law, and they are anti-democratic. And more insidiously, perhaps, they reflect an increasingly hostile environment for Scotland within the Union. What happened to the No campaign refrain of 2014, lead us, don't leave us. What happened to We Love You Scotland? Very strange kind of love indeed, presiding officer. And of course, the biggest lie of all, vote no to protect Scotland's place in the EU. I'll just leave that one there. Patience in Scotland with the UK Tory government is running out across all parts of Scotland and all sectors of Scotland. Indeed, what right-minded person would put their trust in senior UK government Tory ministers like Mr Michael Gove, who believes that it is wise to drive around for 30 minutes to test your eyesight with a young child in the back of your car? We are all fed up with this nonsense. We don't want to see chlorinated chicken, and we don't want to see hormone-fed beef, and we don't want our environmental standards lowered, and we don't want our public health protection standards lowered, and we certainly do not want to see Mr Matt Hancock, the hapless UK Tory Health Secretary, having anything to do with our NHS and seeing salami slicing privatisations through the back door. Presiding officer, in conclusion, the solution in the short term is for the UK government to withdraw these proposals and to put them in the bin. And the solution beyond that remains for Scotland to take control over her own affairs, to determine her own future, and to take a better path. Thank you, presiding officer.
Thank you very much. I call Claudia Beamish to be followed by John Mason. Ms Beamish, please.
Thank you very much, presiding officer. And it's with a conflicted sense of sadness and relief that I speak in the debate on the internal market today. Sadness that it should be necessary at all due to the withdrawal from the EU and also the UK government's subsequent failure to develop common frameworks in a timely and, I stress, inclusive way, now mirrored in the UK White Paper, which is disrespectful, in my view, to the devolved administrations. And relief as well that there is an opportunity to explore how best to proceed here in the interests of Scotland, working with the Scottish Government and our Parliament and a range of stakeholders. So, as our amendment highlights, localism is also threatened in our. This unilateral imposition hinders local level democracy, jurisdiction, and economy, which can so often enable better outcomes for communities to shape their own lives. And restrictions on the development of community wealth building would be very regrettable coming out of COVID. The White Paper proposals are beholden to capital and have no loyalty to place, collaboration, or subsidiarity, a risk undermining any partnership between the local public sector, community, locally owned businesses, and trade unions. Now turning specifically to the environment, which is my brief. I emphasise the 4 UK guiding environmental principles: precaution, prevention, rectifying pollution at source, and polluter pays. The principles matter for our communities and our sustainable development, from the quality of the air we breathe to the water we drink, from the purity of the seawater around the Northern Isles where there are mussel farms to the sustainable farm, and much more. The present continuity bill before the Finance and Constitution Committee and my own Eclair Committee gives the opportunity to ensure again that environmental principles are enshrined in Scottish law, possibly more of them indeed: human health, innovation, non-regression, sustainable development, and a duty to have regard to principles or a requirement to act in accordance with them. All significant issues to explore and get right, but these pale into insignificance when we reflect, as we are today, on the threat to it all from the aims of the UK internal market white paper, both explicit and implicit aims. The serious lack of respect for the devolution settlement shown is arrogant and completely unacceptable. The writing on the wall was there, in my view, when the common frameworks didn't materialise quickly. Now, the white paper poses a serious threat to a range of those common frameworks themselves. It is the UK government's cavalier attitude to environmental standards and to other important EU developments in the public interest that are at the heart of a dangerous challenge to our devolution rights. It is clear that the UK government is not aiming for a baseline which we can all live with, but has a very different agenda: weaker regulation of business. And as the Cabinet Secretary stressed in his statement last week, I quote, "The only certainty is that these proposals would undermine the high quality and standards that Scotland has set for food production and animal welfare for the sole purpose of allowing the UK to do bad trade deals." The Royal Society of Edinburgh shed light on the stark dangers this presents in its submission to the Eclair Committee on the Continuity Bill. It is important, they say, to remember that the environment is not constrained by territorial boundaries. The development and agreement of common frameworks on the environment between the UK and Scottish governments will therefore be crucial. A common environmental framework will ensure measures enacted in Scotland are not undermined by incompatible actions by other UK nations by establishing a mutually acceptable baseline of environmental protection. Indeed, in some cases, Scotland has chosen to go further than the EU, for example, on renewables, and to do differently from England, as we've heard from others, such as on our robust position on GM crops and some of our marine protection commitments. All this should remain possible, but from an agreed baseline and with no cap on higher standards. Professor Campbell Gemmell summarises this latter possibility well when he says, "We may choose to do more, different and better, and that should be done in the full knowledge of the efforts of and through active partnership with our colleagues across the EU. However, all this is blown to smithereens by this UK White Paper, which I strongly oppose, as does the Scottish Labour Party. The Finance and Constitution Committee is absolutely right to call for a much longer, more transparent and inclusive public debate on the proposals, given the significance they have for all citizens of the UK. As it is, this is something which Scottish Labour will not contemplate supporting for the reasons I have highlighted, and those in my own party and in some others this afternoon have done so as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Beamish. I call John Mason to be followed by Alexander Burnett. Mr Mason, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I think the committee is very clear that we recognise the economic benefits to business across the four nations of the United Kingdom of having a set of rules which ensures there are no barriers to trading within the UK. Of course, we want our farmers, our food manufacturers, engineers, beer and whisky producers, among others, to be able to sell freely in other parts of the UK. So I find it bizarre that the Conservatives feel they need to stress the importance of this 60% of our trade, but we can ill afford to lose the other 40%, including 18% with the EU, which the Tories seem quite relaxed about. I would repeat what others have said about how disappointing it was that the UK government held this consultation during the Scottish Parliament recess and then would not take part in our committee session last week. The Welsh response, I thought, was good, short, sharp to the point, as Jackie Bailey quoted it. And, for example, they said, the time frame for consideration of your proposals is, that is the UK government's proposals, is wholly inadequate. They are also unconvinced that primary legislation is needed. We appreciated receiving evidence from a number of organisations, including the Royal Society of Edinburgh. They said that the EU has a clear definition of a single market, but that in contrast, the UK internal market, quote, is a contested term with no single agreed definition, unquote. The RSC also suggested that the EU principles of subsidiarity and proportionality should be adopted within the UK internal market. Now, subsidiarity, as many of us know, means decisions should be made at the lowest appropriate level, and that will often mean Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, rather than London. As the committee letter also says, we previously had evidence suggesting two fundamental questions. Firstly, the degree to which the single market requires the harmonisation of laws and regulations, and how far the requirement of harmonisation extends, and secondly, what range of goods and services should be included in the single market. As the White Paper does not really address these questions, it is difficult to understand the model of internal market that the UK is proposing. As the committee letter also says, there is no discussion about how baseline standards or fundamental principles in relation to environmental policy can be achieved across the UK, given that this is a devolved competence. The current devolution settlement and EU law already allows for often significant policy divergence. It seems to be agreed that frameworks will maintain equivalent flexibility as is afforded by current EU rules. But that suggests to me a fair degree of flexibility for the devolved nations, but again there seems to be a lack of clarity on this. One of the greatest concerns is that these proposals could mean that a reduction in standards in one part of the UK, particularly in England, would have the effect of pulling down standards elsewhere in the UK. Scottish beef, salmon and whisky, to name but 3 of our products, are of a high standard and I am confident can continue to command a premium price on world markets. However, if standards in England repeatedly fall lower, for example because of trade agreements, it will make it very difficult for producers who aim for high quality, with decent wages, high animal welfare and environmental standards to compete on a level playing field. I think we have to remember that the UK is a relatively small player on the world stage and is unlikely to be arguing from a position of strength when it comes to trade agreements. Personally speaking, one of my greatest concerns is that there might be limitations on the measures Scotland could take to try and deal with particular health issues which we face. One of the examples, and others have mentioned it already, is our problem with alcohol and the introduction of minimum unit pricing. That was challenged by the whisky producers, claiming it was unwarranted interference with the market. But thankfully, the EU had a proper structure, including the courts, and we could defend the policy and eventually won. But we are left wondering how such a case would be dealt with by the UK. Similarly, when Germany disagreed with EU rules on tobacco advertising, there were clear procedures in place to settle the dispute, and Germany won because the EU was reckoned to have gone beyond its powers and breached the principle of subsidiarity. The EU had and has these safeguards, but the UK does not seem to. What happens if the UK government goes beyond its powers? Who would rule against them? Frankly, I think this whole process says a lot about Westminster's attitude, and in particular Westminster Conservatives' attitude, both to the Scottish Parliament and also to Scotland as a country. We are a nuisance to them. They see Scotland as a region of England, and the more powers they can take from Wales, Northern Ireland and ourselves, the happier they will be. For many Conservatives, England and Westminster is the place to be, and that is where they want all the power to be and all the decisions to be made. Presumably that is why the new leader of the Conservatives in Scotland left Holyrood after only 13 months. Actions speak louder than words. So I think Boris Johnson and his government have some choices to make. Will they respect this and the other devolved parliaments by listening to the committee report and today's debate, or will they seek to undermine devolution and encourage us to seek our own path for the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Alexander Burnett, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Mr Burnett, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I note members to my register of interests. Now, alongside my Conservative colleagues on the Finance and Constitution Committee, I was disappointed we had to dissent from the submission as a whole to the UK Government White Paper, as there were certainly points in it we might have supported, and certainly parts if they had been slightly amended. It's certainly no reflection on the clerks nor the excellent chairing by Bruce Crawford, who in my time on the committee has excelled in getting the committee to consensus. On this occasion, however, with the length of submission and the shortage of time, I don't think our colleagues on the committee would have appreciated if it's begun to look like an attempt to be the first submission to be filibustered if we had followed normal process. Hence, we took the position we did. However, there will still be ample time for further debate and questioning of ministers once the bill is published. Now, of course, there is much to be covered by the bill, and for the internal market to continue operating effectively, there are 3 guiding principles: no new barriers to trade, collaboration across the UK, and fair and independent and trusted adjudication. And the UK Government is already committed to working with the devolved administrations to agree common frameworks covering specific policy areas returning from the EU. And the UK internal market proposals do not change that. In fact, they build upon and complement the progress already made in developing common frameworks, providing additional certainty for businesses. Now, the shortage of time mentioned has been an issue, but we can only wonder how much more informed we would be had Mike Russell not decided to pull Scottish Government civil servants out of the single market discussions early last year. Now, I believe the UK Government want to work constructively with all devolved administrations on the proposals. So I was pleased to hear that they have stated that the door remains open for the Scottish Government to rejoin and urges them to do so. So I hope Mike Russell can put aside his personal grievances and, for the benefit of Scotland, take them up on that offer. But I also think that it's clear that the UK single market is of no interest to the SNP, except as an opportunity to create division. And to show how little they care for its true value, there was not a single mention of it in the 71 pages of the Scottish Government's economic recovery plan issued the other week. And although mentioned several times today, the value of this market to Scotland clearly needs repeating, since the SNP seem to be particularly slow on the uptake of its importance. So once again, it's 60% of our trade, it's worth over £50 billion, it supports over 500,000 Scottish jobs, it's nearly 3 times as valuable as our trade with the rest of the world, and it's nearly 4 times as valuable as our trade with the EU. But these are evolving times. So last week I asked the Cabinet Secretary what the Scottish Government were doing to monitor the value of the UK internal market to Scotland. And yet, whilst he said it reviews and considers its value, this information is clearly as confidential as salmoned inquiry papers, as it sadly failed to appear in the Economic Recovery Plan. In fact, I can't recall the SNP ever publishing the value of our largest trading market. So like the majority in Scotland, I'd be happier if instead of looking for opportunities to argue for separation, the Scottish Government could provide regular updates on the volume of trade that Scotland has with the rest of the UK and be quick to find ways to improve on it. However, as always, it is left to the Scottish Conservatives and those who understand the important relationship of the UK internal market to defend businesses and jobs in Scotland. The Food and Drink Federation said that many businesses within the food and drink manufacturing industry view the UK and the Republic of Ireland as an internal single market. The Scottish Retail Consortium said that Scottish consumers and our economy as a whole benefit enormously from the UK's largely unfettered internal single market through economies of scale. And the Director General of the CBI, an institution sometimes known as the voice of Brussels, says the internal market principle of mutual recognition is essential to guard against any additional costs or barriers within the UK. So we need to protect those close economic ties and the jobs that rely on them. And it was interesting to see both the Welsh and Northern Ireland submissions demonstrate not only brevity in making similar points as our submission, but also focus much more on the economic importance of the issue. But instead, we have here the usual focus from the SNP. Constitutional arguments, thinking that we are better off without the UK, despite the overwhelming evidence that shows this is not the case. Now, the Cabinet Secretary was keen to quote George Orwell at our committee meeting last week, and we certainly live in Orwellian times. So he may like to know Orwell also said that nationalism is power hunger tempered by self-deception. Well, the Cabinet Secretary may be deceiving himself with a strategy of non-cooperation, but he's not fooling anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Kenneth Gibson, followed by George Adam. Mr Adam will be the last speaker in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's no one more nationalist than the British nationalists in the Tory benches over to the left there. It's clear that few people are being taken in by Tory assertions and assurances. Folk are not so daft, have long memories, and remember that the Tories fought tooth and nail against the very existence of this Parliament. So few believe that the Tories have any interest other than in tightening London's grip. The members opposite should at least have the honesty and decency to admit that intention. A coalition of 40 Scottish environment charities has warned that the UK Government plan to create a post-Brexit UK internal market, which could end up causing significant harm to Scotland's wildlife, landscape and food standards, given it's aimed at both removing regulation and forcing all 4 nations of the UK to adopt the same standards, irrespective of each nation's environmental context or needs. Scotland will have to accept the lowest common denominator, especially where countries negotiating bilateral trade deals with the UK demand lower standards, seriously undermining efforts to combat climate change and biodiversity decline. As Charles Dundas, Chair of Scottish Environment Link, said last week, Scotland's world-renowned natural environment is central to all our lives, and we must not allow arrangements for a UK internal market to put it in jeopardy by dragging standards down. And last Friday, as we've already heard, the National Farmers Union Scotland expressed their concern in a press release headed "White Paper Proposal Presents Risk to Vital Internal UK Markets," which is worth restating. It's a clear view of NFU Scotland and the other UK farming unions that proposals pose a significant threat to the development of common frameworks anti-devolution. The Union stresses the need for agricultural support policies to diverge where necessary, to reflect different needs and objectives in different parts of the UK. The proposal on mutual recognition contained in the paper raises a potential for common frameworks to be rendered meaningless. The UK internal market proposals put forward limit the devolved administration's ability to act if any standards were lowered and give the UK Government a final say in areas of devolved policy such as agriculture, the environment or animal health and welfare. The internal market consultation took place over only 4 weeks in the midst of summer, and we've already heard that the UK Minister, Alex Sharma, contemptuously refused to participate in the inquiry during the involved Parliament's and Assembly recess, tells us there was no real desire to secure well-considered views. After all, the opinion of Scotland's Parliament won't actually be taken into consideration by the UK Tory government, will it? The impact on Scotland's trade, economy, businesses, employment and people of this proposed internal market are momentous, and while we are sadly getting used to it, it's shocking to see the Sewell Convention violated once again. Tory talk of a power surge is deliberately misleading. The White Paper makes it clear that state aid will be removed from this Parliament and reserved to the UK. The White Paper also clearly identified minimum pricing, the smoking ban, animal health and welfare, environmental standards such as recycling targets and deposit return schemes, food safety procurement and other devolved policy areas as being at risk from these proposals. Dean Lockhart, although, is easily pleased. He talks of a massive new powers already devolved. Well, let's give a couple of examples, like the council tax benefit powers that were devolved, but with only 90% of the budget devolved, with it costing this Parliament £22 million and local government £17 million each year. Or employability, devolved after a 93% cut in the budget first. Tory MSPs may be happy with these costly crumbs off the table, but we have higher ambitions for Scotland. This Scottish Parliament is being largely ignored. A few points, 6 to be precise, will be put before committees to be scrutinised, and I know we will do this to the best of our ability, despite a general feeling amongst everyone but the Tories that whilst we take Scottish Parliament deliberations seriously, the Tories prove time and time again they don't. Hazardous substances planning will come to the Local Government and Communities Committee, on which I serve, and it's become all too clear recently how devastating the consequences can be when things go wrong. The Scottish Environment Protection Agency is currently dealing with an application from the Ministry of Defence to increase discharges of radioactive waste from Faz Lane into the Firth of Clyde, which will inevitably have a detrimental impact on Scotland's environment and local communities. If approved, liquid waste from the reactors that drive Royal Navy submarines and the processing of Trident nuclear warheads will be discharged from Faz Lane into the Gairloch nearby via a proposed new pipeline. The application was made under the guise of replacing ageing waste facilities with a new nuclear support hub, words which make it somehow sound almost sustainable. However, the actual plan will lead to cobalt-60 discharges estimated by the MOD itself to be 52 times higher than the average annual discharges of cobalt-60 over the last 6 years. The consultation opened on the 13th of January this year and closed on the 13th of March. Due to an incredibly high number of responses, over 7,000, SEPA is still reviewing them. In addition, when the UK Government's Oil and Pipelines Agency applied to Argyll and Bute Council to use 2 underground tanks to store more petroleum products at the oil fuel depot in Gairlochhead in April, it didn't bother to detail what these substances are made up of. Should we lose powers over such matters, it will be a truly retrograde step. Presiding Officer, to keep an eye on the UK Government and protect our people, the work of the Scottish Parliament and its agencies matter more than ever to the safety, well-being and prosperity of Scotland and those who live here. The way the UK Tory Government has treated the devolved nations makes it painfully clear that what we have heard from Tory MSPs utterly beholden to London and their new king over the water, Douglas Ross MP, regarding increasing the powers of this Parliament is simply hogwash.
Thank you very much. I now call George Adam, and Mr Adam will be the last speaker in the open debate. We then move to closing speeches. Mr Adams, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know what you're thinking. What possibly can I bring to the debate after a long afternoon in the chamber? But there's a couple of points that I want to bring up. If I go over what we've already discussed in today's debate, you know, we started off with the Tories, with Dean Lockhart waffling on about various things that he believed, defending the Tories and the Tory government as much as he possibly can, where I actually believe in his heart of hearts he knows there are issues with this proposal in itself. And then we had Peter Chapman, you know, he's attacking the NFU. Never ever did I think I would see the day when Peter Chapman attacked the National Farmers Union, but I've heard it here today. And obviously those of my colleagues will be cutting and pasting that on social media as quickly as they possibly can. I've also had Alexander Burnett. Now, all I can say about Mr Burnett is he must be one miserable individual, because I have never, ever heard any positivity about anything he has said in this chamber. You know, it really shows you the difference between those in these benches over there and us here that are arguing for a positive future in Scotland. But, Presiding Officer, don't for 1 minute think that this is what the Tories would like you to believe, that the internal market is a simple case of replacing EU rules with the proposals by the UK Government White Paper on the internal market, because it's a lot more than that. It's a power grab. It's a power grab on the devolved nations in the United Kingdom by Westminster. And not only that, but the processes that they propose for it as well are woolly at best. Even if we could all agree on absolutely everything, the proposals in the White Paper would still make it difficult for us to actually work within the processes that they have for us. The UK Government claims that the proposals are to protect business and consumers, but that appears not to be the case. Here's an example. Some of our world-renowned products, Scottish meat and fish, reared to high animal welfare standards, could be ruthlessly undercut by cheap, mass-produced foods from outside Scotland, where for far less care has been given to the product that they produce. And Scotland will be required to accept these goods that meet whatever standards the UK Government decides. And that, for me, is a worrying prospect, because the UK Government would decide anything they wished with regards for a trade deal. Let's just talk out loud and think it's the first thing that comes to mind. Say Donald Trump came to town and Donald Trump decided that he was wanting a trade deal with the United Kingdom. Now, they would quite happily sell their grandmother to make sure that they would get that deal done, not for the benefit of Scotland, not for the benefit of the people of Scotland, but just for their own grubby self-interest. That's the only reason that they want to do it from that perspective. And also, when you look at the fact that, you know, I heard earlier on, it was a bit like a panto season in here. You mentioned chlorinated chicken and the Tories get really animated, you know, but the whole point was that if you look at this, and if in that said trade deal with the United States, there is a potential chance to have chlorinated chicken in Scotland, what would the Scottish Parliament be able to do to stop that? Under these current proposals, absolutely nothing. Why don't we look at a way where the 4 devolved nations can work together, work in mutual respect and find a way to resolve their differences? Anywhere else in the world, that's the way things are done. But not here with this Tory government, where it's all about them regaining control and them taking control even further. You know, if you look at the actual scenario that we have in front of us here, the UK government proposals would confuse at best and actually negate at worst the current arrangements that we have. And that, for me, is a worry. Just imagine, for debate reasons, just imagine that we have a situation where the Scottish Parliament doesn't agree with the UK government. Now, let's shudder to think that would ever happen, but just imagine that happens. There is nothing within these processes that gives any of the devolved nations an opportunity to be able to do anything about that. Presiding Officer, just quickly in closing, I've been a member of the SNP since I was a teenager, and that wasn't yesterday. I've wanted Scottish independence for most of my life, but I also believe passionately in this place, our nation's Parliament. It is an institution I respect and one I would defend with every fibre of my being. The proposed UK internal market is a threat to this place. We cannot allow a government that was not elected by Scotland did not vote for. We cannot allow that government to dictate to Scotland's Parliament.
Thank you very much. I'm now moving to closing speeches. There are 2 members not in the chamber, as far as I can see, who should be in for closing speeches. I hope to hear from them when they are good enough to return. And I now call on Willie Rennie to close for the Liberal Democrats. Mr Rennie, please.
And they might miss my corker of a speech, Deputy Presiding Officer. Such a shame. I'm sure I can repeat it to them later on. This afternoon we will be supporting the Green Amendment, Labour's amendment, in fact our own amendment we'll be supporting as well, but also the main motion from the Government. But we will not be supporting the Conservative amendment this afternoon. Claudia Beamish's, I thought, contribution was one of the best. I think she summed it up well by saying it was a mixture of sadness and relief this afternoon. Sadness that it was necessary at all. Relief that there was an opportunity, ever the optimist, an opportunity to explore how best to progress forward. And Annabel Ewing also, I thought, when she said, it's London's way or the highway, I thought summed it up in some way to some accuracy. But I think Jackie Bailey was, as always, was the best when she spoke well about the value of the internal market, but for the need for us all to have a say on how it works. And I thought that summed it up well. Peter Chapman, that great opponent of the National Farmers Union, spoke this afternoon with great passion. But he went on to talk about who on earth would not be in favour of working with our closest neighbours, our biggest economic neighbours. If only he had said that more loudly during the Brexit referendum, we might not be in this position in the first place. And then, of course, it was full of SNP members who were great converters to the cause of cooperation across the United Kingdom. John Mason, Tom Arthur, Bruce Crawford, all saying, if only we could come together and reach some kind of cooperative agreement across the United Kingdom, despite the fact that they spent all of their political career trying to dismantle the United Kingdom and that kind of cooperation that exists. No, not just now, because I'm coming on to Adam Tompkins, who I thought did speak actually quite well. He's talking about balance and quite well. I know that's high praise from me. Balance and proportionality was what he was talking about, and if we could have some kind of dispute resolution process, and I think he was right about that. What I regret is the fact that he's not prepared for that dispute resolution process to have a greater involvement of the nations and regions of the United Kingdom in a democratic way. And I think that would actually help to solve these issues, the issues that John Mason, Tom Arthur and Bruce Crawford have rightly talked about, of having that set of rules that we can all have a role in. Because I think we all do value, especially in these times of the pandemic, economic cooperation, whether it's within the United Kingdom or across the European Union. I think it's really important that we do that and we do try and work together. Stephen Phillips, who's on the Brexit group at the law firm CMS, said yesterday in The Scotsman, and I think he made this point particularly well, in the EU system, no member state is powerful enough to dictate standards, and there is a complex oversight system involving the EU Commission, Council of Ministers, national governments and the European Parliament to create broad consensus. That is all we're trying to seek in this circumstance. And the Australians view their own system as this. Mutual recognition of standards is a decentralised means of harmonising regulation. Each state is able to pursue its own approach while meeting minimum national standards. And a cumbersome and centralising process of establishing uniform national standards is avoided. In the long run, however, mutual recognition promotes increased uniformity of regulation. And I think they put that very well. The Law Society of Scotland has looked into this issue in some depth too. They point out that England and Scotland already diverge in the law relating to building regulations. See, the Building Act of 1984 is for England and Wales, and the Building Act of 2003 is for Scotland. This is now the UK Conservatives' list for decision in Whitehall. It's on that list. They also point to paragraph 17 to the reference to processes for obtaining construction permits. This too is devolved legislation at the moment under the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1947. This will also be on the Conservatives' list for decisions in Whitehall. I've listened to the Conservatives in the debate. They have set out clearly that they want that uniform system imposed across the whole of the UK on their say-so alone. This is the problem that they beg the question. Why do they want that? The suspicion is, and it's great suspicion, is, and I don't believe the Scottish Conservatives know enough to dispute this, is that the UK government thinks it may need the power to impose products like chlorinated chicken and hormone beef across the United Kingdom in order to get a trade deal with Donald Trump. And if it's not those products, it may be something equally unpalatable. That is the fear, and that is why we fear what the Conservatives are planning to do. And that's why my amendment should have the attraction across the UK. That federal structure, that cooperation, that making sure the nations and regions of the UK have that partnership at its heart. So you can trade in Peterborough and Perth equally so, on those basic standards, whilst recognising the power in each of the parliaments and administrations of the United Kingdom. So let us agree that common approach, because I think that is the best way to keep the United Kingdom together and to have that internal market as strong as it possibly can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. And to allow all closing speakers the opportunity to have their full time, I'm minded to accept a motion without notice that decision time is moved to 5:20. Could I ask Willie Rennie perhaps to move such a motion, Mr Rennie?
Moved with honour, Deputy Presiding Officer.
I don't know what to say to that. The question is that decision time is moved to 5:20. Are we all agreed? Are we all agreed? Oh, that's good. I just heard that. Now can I call Patrick Harvey, please, to close to the Green. 6 minutes, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll be supporting the government position and the Labour amendment. Obviously, I'll be opposing the Conservative amendment, and I'm afraid that the Liberal Democrat one places just a little bit too much confidence in the idea that shared decision-making will in fact protect the people of Scotland. I'm not at all convinced that it will. I suppose it was pretty much inevitable that today's debate would involve at least one or two rants about separatists, and that name being thrown across the chamber from people who support the Brexit project, apparently calling us separatists without either self-awareness or irony. I think it's pretty clear that supporters of independence at the moment are the true internationalists in the chamber, and we'll continue to make that case. There were a number of people right across the chamber, though, who clearly share the central concern here that there is a mechanism for an internal market, but no principles for how that internal market should operate. That's what's being proposed. Whether we're talking about principles of subsidiarity, proportionality, sustainability, a whole host of principles we could debate, they are not defined in the UK government proposals. And this is why it was also a little strange for me to hear the phrase internal market and single market used interchangeably, perhaps unconsciously used interchangeably by some members. The EU single market is clearly defined according to certain principles. The UK proposals for its internal market are not defined, and we've got evidence from a number of other respected bodies to say that this very term is itself contested. It is clearly premature to legislate on it in that circumstance. There was another slip of the tongue being made by a few members, including some on the SNP side, who accidentally, instead of talking about the single market or the internal market, talked about the free market. These are fundamentally different ideas. Whether you're a hard-right libertarian who gives guest lectures with the Cato Institute, or you're a social democrat who believes that market activity needs to be regulated well and effectively in the interest of the public, there is an argument for having a single market, for having a wide area that complies with, broadly speaking, the same rules and conditions. It's not a free market. A single market, an internal market, does not determine whether we should be running a free or a regulated market. And one of the phrases that's been used a few times is around what would be bad for business. I think the Minister talked about not wanting to do things that are bad for business. I say we do need to do some things sometimes that are bad for business. If governments through the ages had taken the view that we should never do anything that's bad for business, never mind minimum unit pricing, we wouldn't have paid holidays, we wouldn't have abolished child labour, we wouldn't have a minimum wage if we had never been willing to do things that are bad for business. And the Scottish Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee didn't say that there should never be any barriers either. What it said was that we recognise the economic benefits to businesses across the four nations of having a set of rules that ensures there are no barriers. Equally, we recognise the benefit to society of having effective regulation of market activity and the role of all parliaments, including this one, in deciding how best to strike that balance. And that's the important point here. There are obviously those who would like to take power, not just away from this Parliament, not just away from Scotland and the other devolved nations, but taking power away from democratically accountable institutions and giving it to the market. And there are those of us who believe the whole economy ought to be democratically accountable. But it is for elected parliaments to decide how best to strike that balance. The proposals coming from the UK government will remove the ability, not just of this Parliament, but of others, to decide how best to strike that balance. The Scottish Government says that there will be no barriers to trade, and I would agree that under their preferred option of common frameworks, I agree it's unlikely that there would be significant barriers to trade, but the principle is that this Parliament and others must be free to act, and parliaments must be free to judge whether those actions are proportionate and whether any consequences for trade are proportionate, and we can be held democratically accountable for those decisions. Mr Lockhart tried to persuade us that the common frameworks, not the UK internal market proposals, but the common frameworks, will deliver new powers. What nonsense! In any policy area that's wholly reserved, common frameworks don't even arise. Common frameworks arise because measures are being debated which do cover existing devolved competencies. So common frameworks are not about devolving new competencies. They're about deciding how to... They're an invitation to align, to agree how we coordinate on areas which are already devolved. Adam Tompkins, I think, did recognise my central concern that we have the design of a mechanism for an internal market without the appropriate principles being attached. And I hope that he'll vote accordingly. I hope that if the UK government continue with their current proposals, he will oppose them if they're unchanged. Finally, Presiding Officer, there were those on the Tory benches laughing at the suggestion that the Thatcher government was one of the drivers of the movement for devolution. I think it's very clear that that was the case. And if they can't bring themselves now to defend devolution and Scotland's democracy, what we chose over 20 years ago, if they insist on cutting the powers of Scotland's Parliament without the permission of Scotland's people, in the interest of a free market extremist ideology, they will drive ever more people toward one inescapable conclusion, that Scotland can, must and will govern itself.
Thank you. I call James Kelly to close for Labour. 7 minutes, Mr Kelly.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think the message coming out loud and clear from this debate is that the devolution process must be respected, and that the majority of parties in this Parliament will reject the attempt by the UK Tory government, supported by the Tory benches, to trample all over the devolution settlement and to treat the devolution process with utter contempt and disrespect. That will be rejected quite rightly tonight when we come to decision time. I think there were three themes that ran through the debate: the concern around the process that's been used here, the negative impact of the proposals being put forward, and how we resolve disputes. I think in terms of the process, the Green Amendment covered it well, and Patrick Harvey spoke at length about that in his opening speech, as did Jackie Bailey. I think the fact that for such an important proposal and piece of legislation, there was only a 4-week consultation process is absolutely absurd. And also the way that it was sneaked out
during the summer recess, therefore undermining the ability for proper scrutiny is something that, you know, really people really regret. That was shown, the kind of contempt around that was shown, I have to say, by Alex Sharma in his refusal to give evidence to the Finance and Constitution Committee. As Patrick Harvey rightly pointed out, he was able to visit Glasgow, but he wasn't able to, you know, come on an hour and a half on a Zoom call to speak to the Parliament's committee to discuss the proposal. And I think that was totally unacceptable. And it shows that the heart of the Tory approach to this, it's an attempt to sneak through and to impose the proposals without proper discussion and without any proper debate. And when you look at the impact of some of the proposals, you can perhaps understand why they don't want too much scrutiny. You know, Claudia Beamish, you know, really got to the heart of it in terms of how it would undermine the environmental principles and those of sustainability, which have been so important to the Scottish Parliament. And really, that is no way to go about trying to protect those important principles. I also think in terms of that, Joan McAlpine made, you know, a very important contribution in talking about state aid and the importance of state aid being included in the devolution proposals. I think she was right to point out that Donald Dewar very much did have in mind the impact of the Thatcher government decisions on communities in Scotland. I'm old enough to remember when the steelworks in Cambuslang closed nearby where I grew up and where I still stay, in fact, and represent, and the absolutely devastating impact that that had, not only in Cambuslang but in communities throughout Scotland. And I think it was very much that experience of some of the decisions of the Thatcher government destroying the manufacturing base in Scotland and having a devastating effect on communities that led to the decision to, you know, include state aid in the devolution process, because we need that protection going forward. I think one of the other key themes that ran through the debate was how we resolve disputes. And in actual fact, that's been part of the problem, that it's taken so long, and we obviously still don't have the answer to how we resolve the UK internal market going forward. But there's been a continued controversy about the disputes process. Adam Tompkins referenced it, and Willie Rennie covered it at length in his opening speech, and also features in the Lib Dem amendment. You know, I think if this is going to work going forward, we need a mechanism to resolve disputes, and that can't be done by one Parliament imposing its view on another, or one Parliament expressing a veto to take it out of the agreement. It's got to be done through consensus and cooperation. I find the Tory approach to this debate in a lot of ways quite bizarre. You know, Alec Rowley underlined that when he said that, in effect, what the Tories are doing is they're undermining the devolution process, you know, something that's been in place for 21 years. The Tories did obviously oppose it at the original referendum, and it's interesting that it's now come full circle with what they're arguing today. But they're also undermining the case for staying in the United Kingdom. And those of us who support that and genuinely believe that it's best for the United Kingdom, I say genuinely to the Tory benches, you need to change your attitude and change your approach. I think the way forward on this is to take the proposals off the table. I agree with Jackie Bailey. I think it's important that we have a proper mechanism for how the UK internal market works going forward. But the way to achieve that, I think, is through dialogue, is through proper use of the intergovernmental machinery, and to find a solution that all four nations will approach. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour will oppose the Tory amendment tonight, support the government motion, obviously support our own amendments and the Lib Dem and Green amendments, and the bulk of the parties in this Parliament will stand against the Tory government proposals. Let's have proper consensus and an approach that suits all four nations.
Thank you very much. I now call Maurice Golden to oppose the Conservatives. 8 minutes, please, Mr Golden.
Officer, today's debate should be about how Scotland can best use the internal market to create jobs, boost business and help our economic recovery. The Scottish Parliament will soon gain dozens of new powers, and it should be the perfect opportunity to have a positive, forward-looking debate. Unfortunately, this discussion has been dominated, as it so often is, by yet another of the SNP's pointless, repetitive and self-serving constitutional arguments. This time, it is a supposed power grab. Only the SNP can't name one single power that has been grabbed, and for good reason. No power of this Parliament is being taken away. In fact, the opposite is true. Over 100 extra powers will come from the EU to the Scottish Parliament. Yet the SNP want to take these new Scottish parliamentary powers and hand them straight back to Brussels. As my colleague Dean Lockhart said, it would be the biggest power surrender this Parliament has ever seen. Given the outrage we have heard from the nationalist politician today, you would think they would be lining up to say no power should ever be handed away from this Parliament. But of course, this outrage is, as usual with SNP, fake and phony grievance. Happy to give way to John Mason.
John Mason.
Thank you. Would you accept that the EU has structures to protect individual countries and the UK does not?
Maurice Golden.
The UK White Paper will have structures, and I think, as we've heard today, there is work that is required on dispute resolution, but when you're facing a debate as this one, characterised by grievance and hatred, it's not one of the best ways in which we can come together to actually look at how we improve the White Paper and ultimately deliver for the people of Scotland, which is what I want to do. So we've heard from the Nationalists, from Joan Mackay-Pine, from Bruce Crawford and from Patrick Harvey complaining about the UK government, about timescales, about consultation. But it's hard to consult with the SNP when they pulled out of the four-nation effort a year ago. If they want consulted, they needed to engage. Alexander Burnett made this point strongly and emphasised that Mike Russell must put aside his personal grievance and re-engage. The UK government has left the door open. I don't hold out much hope, as nationalism is power hunger tempered by self-deception, as Alexander Burnett pointed out earlier. The SNP also say that frameworks should be used instead of this bill. Frameworks will be used and are important. But this bill provides a minimum safety net for businesses not covered by frameworks. It also stops the SNP reducing food and environmental standards, which is a very real threat. Kenny Gibson said the bill would prevent DRS and minimum unit pricing in Scotland. Utter hogwash, and the SNP know it. The Minister said we will see lower food standards.
Just quieten a little. I'd like to hear what Mr Golden has to say. Mr Golden, please continue.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Minister said we will see lower food standards. Given the world-class produce we have in Scotland and across the UK, this is a real insult to our farmers. The UK Government have been absolutely clear. We will never compromise food safety or the environment. Happy to give way to Kenneth Gibson.
Kenneth Gibson, wait till you're called.
Mr.
Gibson, calm down. Wait till I call you. Kenneth Gibson.
Once again, I thank Mr Golden for allowing me to ask an intervention. If that's the case, why does NFU not believe you when you talk about protecting food standards, etc.?
Maurice Golden.
Well, one thing we do know about NFUS, they've said it's crystal clear that the UK market is by far the most significant market for Scottish agricultural produce, and I think the SNP should begin to recognise that. But while we're on the subject, both Annabel Ewing and George Adam brought up chlorinated chicken. They need to understand that chlorinated chicken is already illegal in the United Kingdom. It may be the case that SNP MPs want to introduce legislation at Westminster to allow the importation of chlorinated chicken, but the UK government will fight against this every step of the way. The irony is that they complain about a power grab when, as we speak...
No, please. It's not actually a please. I was just being polite. I want to hear this. Thank you. Mr Golden, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The irony is that when the SNP complain about a power grab, when, as we speak, they effectively want to hand powers back to Brussels via the EU Continuity Bill, a bill that will enable SNP ministers to accept laws made in Brussels and would enable the SNP to effectively split the Scottish economy from the rest of the UK to the detriment of Scotland. The inconvenient truth for the SNP is that 60% of Scottish exports go to the rest of the UK, worth more than £50 billion to Scotland, and that is more than our trade with the rest of the world combined. In context, for every £3 of goods Scotland exports to the EU, Scotland trades £10 to the rest of the UK, and over 500,000 Scottish jobs rely on it. This point was strongly made by my colleague Adam Tompkins, who said eloquently, no one, whether unionist or nationalist, should imagine that it is in their interest to erect new barriers to trade between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Peter Chapman said he was absolutely astounded that the SNP are willing to put Scotland's economy and people's livelihoods in jeopardy. I must admit, I am not. The UK Internal Market Bill will provide certainty that products made in one part of the UK will not face additional barriers to market in another part of the UK, and that consumers in one part of the UK are not disadvantaged by limiting access to goods and services. Not only is this just plain common sense, it is what we have done for centuries. Now, thinking about the amendments today, Scottish Labour's amendment shows a lack of understanding regarding the legislation, ably demonstrated by Alex Rowley, but I thought that Jackie Bailey's contribution, particularly around dispute resolution, warrants further study and consideration. As for the Liberal Democrats, we can agree that a smooth-running UK internal market is in the interest of everyone in the UK. However, I am a strong advocate of devolution and do not see federalism as a solution to a Scottish Government which refuses to engage. But Willie Rennie's contribution was valuable. We won't be supporting the Greens, and as for the SNP's motion, I would urge the SNP, if they care at all about Scotland's economic well-being, then engage constructively with the UK Government. It's time for the SNP to put Scotland first.
Thank you very much, Mr Golden. I now call Michael Russell to close the Scottish Government Cabinet Secretary. 10 minutes or thereabouts, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as ever with a debate like this, there have been some really good contributions and there have been some dire contributions. The good ones are right across the party. I have to commend Alec Rowley, Patrick Harvey, Willie Rennie. I disagree with him on some of the points he made, but I thought it was, as was said, valuable as a contribution. Claudia Beamish, Annabel Ewing, Jackie Bailey. But it's easy to spot the dire ones because they were all from the Tory benches, with one exception. I'm going to come back to that exception at the end of what I say. And they were also characterised by 2 points in common in all those dire speeches. And they're curious points because they're facts that are utterly wrong. If it is true, as each of the speakers asserted, those Tory speakers, that regulatory convergence was essential for trade, why are we leaving the EU? It's absolutely untrue that regulatory convergence is essential for trade, and yet that was the point that they made. And the second point is not the second point. No, I won't. You've had your opportunity. Presiding officer has had his opportunity. I want to respond to the points that have been made. And I shall come to the points that Mr Lockett has made in a moment. The second point that was common to these Tory speeches was an assertion that there were lots of powers which, if you rejoined the EU, you would just give away again. The reality is there aren't lots of powers coming back. That's absolutely clear. That is simply untrue. But it does say something about the view of the EU. The Tory members do not recognise that Scotland, as an independent member of the EU, would have vastly more powers than it has as a member of the UK, and that is irrefutable. And the idea that, in some sense, being a member of the EU simply means handing powers to Brussels is, at worst, just a tabloid invention, but at best now simply the Tory party philosophy. So let me make a third point that underpins these absolutely clear. Scotland voted to remain in the EU. And that is a fact that's simply been ignored by every Tory member. They don't want the reality of this situation. Scotland does not want to have the Tories drag them out of Europe. And that is also irrefutable. But I have to say, of all the dire speeches, I think it's a hard job to decide which was worst. But I have to say it really has to be Peter Chapman's for one particular reason. It was an encyclopedia of irrelevance, completely. It was a cornucopia of nonsense and negativity. But there was one thing in it that really did worry me. Because Mr Chapman asserted during the speech that Scotland would not become a member of the EU if it was independent. Now, on the one side of this argument, you have Peter Chapman. On the other side of this argument, you have the former President of the Commission, Van Rompuy, you have Lord Kerr, you have endless EU diplomats and others. Who would you receive? Who would you trust? The former President of the Commission or Peter Chapman? I think I know who I would trust. But actually, what worries me about this, and Mr Chapman is grinning there as if there is some virtue in being put in this, because what really worries me about this is that anybody at all, whether they were in Scotland or not, would somehow be happy at the fact that a small, talented country like Scotland would be refused membership of the EU. I find that just extraordinary. And what's more extraordinary is that somebody who is a member of this Scottish Parliament would be happy at that fact. I give way to Mr Chapman.
Peter Chapman.
The reason that an independent Scotland would not be allowed into the EU is because your fiscal deficit is 3 times greater than it would be allowed you to get in.
Cabinet Secretary.
And again, it proves 2 points. One was the relish with which that was said. And the other one was that if the President of the European Commission can say to my face, the former President, that we would be able to join, I'll take his word for it, not the word of the Doric Donald Trump. Now, let us move onwards. I should have welcomed Dean Lockhart to his new role. It's always good to see who will be against you over the next few months. I have to say I was disappointed. I think that slavish loyalty is not the thing that spokespeople should do, nor should you argue that black is white and white is black, which was clearly what was being done. But I am, at the end of this contribution, presiding officer, going to make a positive suggestion for Mr Lockhart, some way in which he can redeem himself from the rather bad start that he has had today. Because the bad start, of course, was not simply because of his contribution, but because the arguments are against him. If you go through all these submissions from organisations, there are more, you find the overwhelming weight of the argument from Scottish organisations is against the UK government's proposals. Overwhelming. And not just Scottish organisations. There's an astonishing letter from the PACAT committee at Westminster, which actually contradicts virtually everything that Dean Lockhart said. The SCDI expressed themselves not convinced that the legislative approach is the right priority. The Royal Society of Edinburgh is not convinced that legislation is required. The National Farmers Union says it is clear that common frameworks could provide a more effective alternative to manage divergence while respecting devolution. Even the House of Lords Committee on the Constitution, not full of mad gnats by any manner of means, is not convinced that legislation is required. And then when you look at the detail of some of these submissions, the General Teaching Council, again, not a terribly radical body, looking at the issue of teacher qualifications, saying these proposals undermine a historic and continuing right in Scottish education. And more interestingly still, the submission of the Clyde fishermen, which points out that proposals from the UK government actually will make the internal market worse, not better. And as for the history, it is a complete misrepresentation of the historical background, particularly of the Act of Union. But the White Paper stands revealed today for what it actually is. It is a power grab, a cobbled-together power grab, motivated by fear that Scotland will stand in the way of the bad trade deals that are being done. It is an amateur attempt at legislation, unduly influenced by a former Tory MP. It's an expression of the deep antipathy, indeed the contempt towards devolution that is held by Boris Johnson and his government. It is an astonishing admission of the failure of the UK government to recognise the reality of what the EU single market is and its value, and try to rewrite that in a form of rules that would not even pass muster at first attempt in Europe. But it could also be an opportunity for Mr. Lockhart. Because Mr. Lockhart could look at this, could look at what I think will happen this afternoon, which is a vote against the White Paper. He will look at the clear view of so many stakeholders, and he could also listen to the wise caution of one of their own members. Because I thought Adam Tompkins' contribution was the best that I have heard him make. It's ironic that the best contribution I've heard from him on the Constitution comes when he is no longer the Constitution spokesperson, but that's life. I think that what he said on the legal underpinning of frameworks was very significant. And I do think the principles of proportionality and subsidiarity pointed out in this chamber in a quote I used from David Edward 2 weeks ago are fundamental to the discussion that we're having. And without that, mutual recognition and non-discrimination cannot operate without those principles in place. So how would that be taken forward? Well, I disagree with Mr. Tompkins, as I would disagree with him on the issue of compulsion. I do not think there is a place in this for compulsion, but there is a place in this for agreement, as I indicated to the committee last week, and I will indicate again here. I have never said that we should not work and use the frameworks as the foundation for the future. In fact, I've always said that that's what we should do. And that is why my officials have worked so hard to establish the frameworks. I hope Mr. Lockhart will correct the record in what he said that we did not take part in framework discussions, because we did. So in these circumstances, I will give way.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you very much. I should have made it clear that Mike Russell walked out of discussions on the internal market. Given his concerns about mutual recognition and the request, in some respects, to have various exemptions in place for Scottish business under mutual recognition, does he not recognise that was a massive lost opportunity 18 months ago, walking away from those discussions and the ability to represent business? That has been a wasted opportunity, Cabinet Secretary.
The record will show that I withdrew our officials from the discussions on the internal market because I believed, and I was right to believe, that these would lead to a proposal that would undermine devolution. It has proved exactly as I said it would. Indeed, I should be thanked for having taken that action. But I have never walked away from the discussion of frameworks. And if there is a will in the UK government not to impose upon this Parliament or the Welsh Assembly or the Northern Irish, but to sit down and continue the discussion of frameworks, as I said to the committee last week, I make another offer, which is, of course, there will be no changes. I believe that these proposals are a set of proposals looking for a problem which doesn't exist, but there will be no changes to the arrangements that take place. Those frameworks will operate as if they were in place until they are in place. And that is something I would commit myself to, and I'm sure other governments would do that too. So here's an opportunity for Mr. Lockhart. He doesn't seem yet willing to take it, but I hope he will. Let him go to the people for whom he speaks elsewhere and say to them, look, this is the wrong set of proposals. And it's not just Scottish Parliament that says it, though it says it. It is the vast range of stakeholders in Scotland. Let us find a better way forward. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. Today that man is Adam Tompkins. I hope his own party are listening to him.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate, and it's time to move on to the next item of business. There will be a short pause.
Thank you, colleagues. We'll move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 22455 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, revising tomorrow's business. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has asked to speak on the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 22455 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We're going to turn to decision time now. The first question is that Amendment 22437.3 in the name of Dean Lockhart, which seeks to amend motion 22437 in the name of Michael Russell on internal market be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Now, we're not agreed. This is a division, and as members will know, we're still in the early stages of the new remote voting system, so I'm going to suspend the meeting temporarily to make sure all our members in their constituencies can join the vote. We're temporarily suspended.